Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. My brother Max and I were excited. New town, new house, a fresh start. The house was big, old, and a little rundown, but it was ours. The neighborhood was quiet. We didn't have many neighbors, just a few houses scattered across the street and behind us. But there was one house that caught my attention. Across the street, at the farthest corner, stood a large, decrepit mansion. The windows were always dark, and the yard was overgrown, with wild vines creeping up the walls. It didn't look abandoned, but no one ever went in or out. I'd often see it through our window, especially late at night, when the streetlights cast long shadows over the place. There was something strange about it. Max didn't care much. He was busy with school and video games, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that house. One evening, after dinner, I decided to go explore. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my heart racing as I made my way across the street. The air was thick, unusually cold, as if the house itself was holding the chill around it. The front gate creaked as I pushed it open, and the gravel path crunched beneath my feet. My flashlight flickered as I approached the porch. The house loomed over me, dark and silent. I stepped onto the porch, and that's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps from inside. I froze, straining to hear. Someone was walking around in there. I hadn't seen anyone in the yard when I walked up, so where were they? I leaned in closer to the window, trying to peer inside. There was a shadow moving across the curtains, unmistakable and distinct. Then the door creaked open. I stumbled, back, heart pounding. A tall figure stepped into the doorway, a man with pale skin wearing a black suit. He stared directly at me, his face expressionless. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It felt like he was waiting for me to speak. "Can I help you?" His voice was low, calm, but carried an unsettling weight. I wanted to say something, to explain that I was just curious, but I couldn't form words. The man didn't smile. He didn't blink. He just stood there, watching me with those cold, unblinking eyes. Suddenly, I heard a voice behind me. "Who's there?" I whipped around to see Max standing at the end of our driveway, looking confused and worried. I turned back to the man in the doorway, but he was gone. The door was now shut, the windows dark once again. There was no sign of the figure. Max jogged over to me. "What's going on?" I was breathless, my mind racing. I don't know. I thought I saw someone in there." Max frowned and looked over at the house. "It's been empty for years. No one lives there." I tried to argue, but I felt an odd heaviness in my chest. The man I saw had been real, hadn't he? I wasn't imagining it. But the house, the people inside, it didn't make sense. Max was right. The house had always been empty. So why had I seen him? We went back inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the window. The street outside was silent, and the house across the street seemed to loom even larger in the darkness. The shadows moved strangely around it. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. A soft, creaking sound. I looked out the window. There, in the same spot where the man had stood earlier, was a figure. This time, it was a woman. Her long, dark hair fell over her face as she stood motionless in front of the house. I couldn't make out her features, but her presence sent a chill through me. She didn't move. She just stared at the house, as if waiting for something. Or someone. I watched her for a while, heart racing. Then, without warning, the woman turned and walked toward the door. She opened it, and it swung wide, but the figure did not enter the house. Instead, she looked back at me. Her eyes locked onto mine through the window. That's when I saw it. Behind her, standing in the hallway, was the man. The same tall, pale figure. He was smiling now, a twisted, sickening smile, as if he had been waiting for her. Suddenly, the woman stepped back, closing the door. The house went completely still again, the curtains drawn, the windows dark. I couldn't breathe. My mind spun. What was going on in that house? The next morning, I told Max what I had seen. He was skeptical, of course, but when I mentioned the man and the woman, his face went pale. "Wait, what did you say about the woman?" I described her to him. Her long, dark hair, the way she stood there, just watching. Max went quiet for a moment before saying, "That's the same woman I saw when I first moved here. But I didn't tell you. I was too scared. Every night, she stands there, staring at the house." I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. Max had seen her too, but then he added something that made my blood run cold. "Sometimes she looks at me and then disappears. It's like she's waiting for someone to open the door, like she's waiting for us." The moment I stepped into the auction house, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't the building itself. It was old, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was the air, thick and stale, as if it hadn't been aired in years. The low murmur of the crowd had an eerie quality to it, like everyone was speaking in whispers, yet no one was saying a word. My friends and I had heard about this exclusive auction. The items were said to be from places no one had ever dared explore. Intrigued, we decided to check it out. The room was dim, only a few flickering lights above casting shadows across the tall, marble columns. An old man with a sharp suit stood behind the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd. He smiled when he saw us, his lips twisting in a way that didn't seem quite human. "Welcome," he said, his voice deep, like the creaking of old wood. "Tonight, you will have the opportunity to acquire pieces, unlike any you've ever seen." He wasn't wrong. The first item up for auction was an old wooden chest. It looked harmless enough, ancient and worn, the kind of thing you might find in an attic. But when the lid was opened, the smell hit me. It wasn't a smell of old wood or dust. It was a stench of rot, the kind that makes your stomach churn. The chest was empty except for a small handwritten note resting at the bottom. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel its presence, like it was whispering something in my mind. The crowd was oddly still as the auctioneer began his bidding. I turned to my friends, and I could see they were unsettled too. Jake, always the skeptic, leaned in close. "Something's off about this place," he whispered. "Let's get out of here." But something held me in place, an invisible pull that I couldn't ignore. And when the auctioneer called for the next item, I found myself walking toward the front without meaning to. The next piece was even more bizarre. A cracked mirror, its surface distorted in a way that made the reflection look wrong. It warped the image of anyone who looked at it, elongating features, twisting faces into grotesque shapes. The crowd's excitement grew as the bidding began. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The mirror seemed to reach out to me, pulling my gaze, making my heart race. I felt trapped in the reflection, as though I was being sucked in, piece by piece. I forced myself to turn away, and that's when I saw it. The painting. It was hung in the corner of the room, surrounded by shadows. A figure stood there, cloaked in darkness with no clear features, just an absence where its face should have been. But its eyes were unmistakable. I don't know how, but I knew. They were staring directly at me. The auctioneer was still speaking, but his voice had become muffled. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the painting. It felt like the room was closing in around me, the air thick with something unnatural. I could hear the whispers now, but they weren't coming from the crowd. They were coming from the painting, from the empty eyes that followed my every movement. I turned, my pulse pounding in my ears, and ran for the door. But it wouldn't open. Panic rose in my chest. I could hear my friends calling out to me. But the words were drowned out by the increasing whispers growing louder and louder. "You cannot leave." It wasn't in my head. The words were spoken aloud by the painting. Its voice was hollow, distant, as if it came from the deepest recesses of the earth. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. The room grew colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls, and then the whispers stopped. The lights flickered. I turned around. The auctioneer was gone. The crowd was gone. The only thing left in the room was the painting, and it was moving. The figure stepped out of the frame, its form no longer a blur of shadow but a solid, dark figure standing in front of me. It was taller than any man I had ever seen, its limbs too long, its body too thin. The face remained empty, a void, but I could feel it watching me, its gaze cutting through me like ice. My friends were gone. The doors were still locked. The room felt endless, the walls bending inward. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped closer, and I felt its coldness like a weight pressing down on my chest. And then, with a sudden lurch, I was back in the real world. The auction house was gone. The room was normal again, bright lights, crowded with people. But I wasn't alone. I turned to find my friends standing beside me, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. They hadn't seen anything, but they could feel it too, the strange, unnatural presence that still clung to us. We left the building as quickly as we could, never looking back. But the whispers followed us, and I realized then that the auction had never ended. It had only just begun. I've always been afraid of elevators. The idea of being trapped in a small enclosed space with no way out just unnerved me. But when I started my new job, the building had an elevator, and I had no choice but to use it. It wasn't a fancy building, just a nondescript office in the middle of a busy city. The elevator was old, probably as ancient as the building itself. Its brass buttons were worn down and the floor smelled faintly of mildew, but I could never quite put my finger on why. Still, I would get on and press the button to my floor, trying to ignore the sense of dread that would settle in my stomach every time. One Friday evening, after everyone had left for the weekend, I found myself working late. I was tired, eager to get home, and the last thing I wanted was to climb up the stairs to the 8th floor. The elevator was the quickest way out, so I reluctantly stepped in. The moment I pressed the button for the ground floor, something felt wrong. The elevator jolted as if it had been powered off for a split second before starting up again. I brushed it off as a malfunction, nothing to worry about. But then it stopped. It wasn't supposed to stop. The elevator had passed several floors before it abruptly came to a halt between the 3rd and 4th floors. I pressed the emergency button, but the light blinked red and nothing happened. I tried the phone, but the line was dead. I could hear nothing but the faint hum of the elevator's machinery. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself, pushing aside the growing panic. Minutes passed. Maybe 10, maybe 20. I don't know how long I sat there staring at the faded, chipped doors in front of me. I thought about what to do next, but I was too paralyzed to act. Just as I began to gather the strength to press the emergency button again, the elevator moved. It didn't start from the 3rd floor where it had stopped. It shot straight down, far faster than it should have been able to, shaking violently as it went. I screamed and grabbed the sides of the walls, my heart hammering against my chest. The elevator finally screeched to a halt with such force that it threw me against the back wall. I was dazed but unharmed. But when I opened my eyes, something was different. The lights flickered before settling into a low, sickly yellow glow. The buttons were different now. There were more of them, a whole new row that hadn't been there before. I pressed the button for the ground floor again, but the light didn't turn on. I tried to press a few other buttons, but none lit up. The elevator remained still. The doors suddenly slid open, but what I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. It wasn't the building's lobby. It wasn't even the floor I'd last seen before entering the elevator. It was a hallway. A hallway I didn't recognize. The walls were dark, the paint peeling, and there was a low buzzing sound that seemed to come from nowhere. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically. Didn't know where I was. I knew the building, and this wasn't part of it. My breath caught in my throat as I instinctively stepped out of the elevator. The second I crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut behind me, and I heard the unmistakable sound of the elevator descending again. I panicked. I tried the door, but it was locked. I knocked on the walls, yelling for help, but it was useless. There was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the buzzing lights and the oppressive silence. Then I heard footsteps. They weren't my own. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, growing louder with every passing second. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned to run back to the elevator, but before I could reach it, the doors opened again. This time, there was no strange hallway, no unfamiliar setting, just the regular lobby. The normal lobby I knew, the familiar beige carpet, the soft hum of the air conditioning, and the sound of the building's entrance doors opening and closing in the distance. I stepped into the elevator, my legs shaky, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I pushed the button for the ground floor. The elevator moved smoothly this time, as if nothing was wrong. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I was met with a completely normal lobby, bustling with employees and visitors as if the entire evening had been a figment of my imagination. But as I stepped out, I noticed something chilling. There, in the corner of the room, just behind the reception desk, was the same elevator I had just taken. And standing inside it was a figure, staring directly at me with empty eyes. I froze, my heart racing. The figure was me. It was supposed to be a simple celebration, my best friend's farewell party. Jenna had secured a job overseas, and we'd all gathered to say goodbye before she left. We rented a small hall in the city, decorated it with lights, and set up a buffet. The music played, people laughed, and for a while everything felt perfectly normal. But I should have noticed something sooner. There was a man standing in the corner of the room, just watching us. He wore a plain black suit, his face expressionless, and his eyes, dark, almost too dark, never left the crowd. At first, I thought he was just a friend of a friend, someone I hadn't met yet. I didn't think much of it, but as the evening went on, I started to feel uneasy. Jenna had noticed him too. "Do you know who he is?" she asked, her voice low. I glanced over. "No idea. He's been there all night, hasn't he?" Her lips tightened into a thin line. He wasn't invited. We both turned to look at him again, and that's when I saw it. He was too still, standing perfectly upright as if waiting for something. And his eyes, they seemed to follow every movement in the room, every laugh, every conversation. "Maybe he's just a guest," I suggested, but even I knew I didn't believe that. I went to the bar to get a drink, and when I returned, the man was closer. His gaze was fixed on me now, cold and unwavering. Something in his stare made my skin crawl. I hurried back to Jenna, but by the time I reached her, she was no longer at the table. I searched for her, calling her name, but the music seemed to drown out my voice. The whole room was spinning now, and panic began to bubble up inside me. It was as if the air had thickened. My thoughts were clouded and I couldn't focus. Then I saw Jenna, standing near the man, her eyes wide, her body stiff. She wasn't moving. She wasn't speaking. "Jenna?" I rushed over to her, her head snapped around and her eyes locked with mine. Don't come any closer," she whispered. "I can't move." I grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away, but she didn't budge. The man was watching us now, and I could feel a terrible weight in the air. A pressure, as if something invisible was holding us in place. I tugged harder, but nothing happened. And then, in that moment of complete stillness, the man smiled. Slowly, unnaturally, stretching his lips so wide that his face almost seemed to crack. His teeth were sharp, too sharp, jagged like broken glass. A chill ran down my spine. I couldn't breathe. "Please, run," Jenna pleaded, her voice strained. But I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. The man stepped closer, and with each step he took, the temperature in the room dropped. His smile widened even more, as if he was savoring our fear. Finally, he spoke, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "You're all staying," he said softly. "No one leaves." Just as I thought I might collapse from the pressure building in my chest, the lights flickered and the man disappeared, vanished into thin air, leaving behind an almost suffocating silence. The room snapped back to normal. Jenna and I were suddenly free to move again. She fell into my arms, shaking, and we stumbled out of the hall gasping for air. We never spoke of it again, not to each other, not to anyone. And though Jenna left for her new job, I know what we saw that night. I saw it too clearly to ever forget. That man wasn't just a stranger. He was something far worse. And that night, it wasn't a farewell party. It was a trap. It was supposed to be a simple job. I'd been hired to take care of a woman's elderly uncle, Mr. Mallory, for the weekend. The family had gone out of town and they wanted someone to check on him, keep him company, and make sure he took his medication. He lived alone in a sprawling old mansion that had been in his family for generations, perched on a cliffside overlooking the ocean. The place was remote, isolated, the kind of house you'd expect to see in horror movies. I didn't mind. I needed the money. Mr. Mallory was pleasant enough, slow-moving, frail, but with a sharp mind. He lived in the parlor most of the time, sitting by the window and staring out at the sea. He'd occasionally speak to me, but most of the time, he preferred the silence. It was eerie, but I chalked it up to his age. The first evening, after dinner, he asked me to close the heavy curtains in the parlor. It was getting dark, and he didn't like the view of the ocean at night. "Too many things out there," he muttered cryptically, his hand shaking as he handed me the curtain rope. I thought little of it. It was just a man's preference. I finished, closing the curtains, and the room seemed to shrink in the dim light, making it feel even more isolated. Mr. Mallory had retreated to his chair, staring vacantly at the floor. "Don't mind the house, dear," he said without looking up. "It has its secrets, and some of them are still here." I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off. Old people often said strange things. The night passed uneventfully, though I found it difficult to sleep in the house. The wind howled outside, and the sound of creaking floorboards in the halls kept me on edge. At around 2 a.m., I was awoken by a noise, a soft scraping sound coming from downstairs. I held my breath. It came again, louder this time. A faint dragging, like something heavy moving across the floor. I hesitated, but decided to investigate. I tiptoed down the dark staircase, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. As I reached the bottom, the noise stopped. My flashlight flickered as I shone it into the hallway. Nothing. Just empty rooms, their doors ajar. I took a few cautious steps forward. Then I saw it, a shadow, barely visible, moving from one room to the next at the far end of the hallway. I froze. The shadow didn't belong to anyone I knew. It was too tall, too thin, and it moved with an unnatural fluidity. I called out, "Hello, Mr. Mallory?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even seem to hear me. Slowly, I crept closer, my heart hammering in my chest. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. Mr. Mallory stood there, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "Don't follow it," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's been watching me for years." Before I could ask what he meant, the shadow moved again, disappearing into one of the rooms. I felt the blood drain from my face. I turned to Mr. Mallory. "Who is it? What is that thing?" His voice cracked. "You don't want to know. Stay upstairs. Stay out of its reach. It's waiting." I didn't need to be told twice. I rushed back up to the parlor, locking the door behind me. My pulse was racing, and my hands were clammy. What was that thing? Why didn't Mr. Mallory seem shocked? The night dragged on in silence. The next morning, Mr. Mallory seemed calm, almost normal. He was sitting in his chair again, staring out the window at the churning sea. I wanted to ask him more about last night, but he simply looked at me and said, "You don't want to know." When the family returned later that afternoon, everything seemed fine, too fine. The house was silent, the air still. They were surprised to find Mr. Mallory in good spirits, talking about the weather. Nothing unusual. I mentioned the strange occurrences, but they dismissed it with a laugh. "He's getting on in years," they said. "Sometimes his mind plays tricks on him." But I wasn't convinced. As I left the house that evening, I glanced back at the dark windows of the mansion. And there, at the top floor, I saw it. A shadow. A figure standing perfectly still, staring down at me. Its face was pale, twisted, empty, just like Mr. Mallory had described. I couldn't explain what it was, but as I drove away, I realized the terrifying truth. The figure in the window hadn't been watching Mr. Mallory all these years. It had been watching me. I work as an audio engineer for a small, independent podcast company. One night, my boss handed me a recording and asked me to clean up the sound for a special episode. Something unusual. It was an old tape, one of those analog cassettes that hadn't been used in years. The label was faded, but it read only 2 words. "Listen carefully." Curious, I popped the tape into the machine. The first few seconds were filled with static. Then, a soft voice broke through, barely audible at first. "Hello?" It was a woman's voice, distant, trembling. I turned up the volume to hear better, but as I did, the voice grew clearer. "I need to tell you something. If you hear this, it's too late. It's already too late." I paused the recording, my fingers hovering over the controls. A feeling of unease settled in my stomach. It felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be listening. But I continued. The voice spoke again. More, urgently this time. "Don't trust the man with the glasses. Don't let him in." I couldn't stop listening. The fear in her voice was palpable, and every word sent a chill down my spine. The rest of the recording was a jumble of muffled sounds, breathing, footsteps, and a sharp metallic scraping noise, followed by a loud crash that made me jump. Then came a silence so thick it felt suffocating. "Please," the voice whispered. "They're coming for you. Don't—" The tape cut off abruptly. I rewound the tape and played it again, but this time there was nothing. No voice, no sounds, just dead silence. It didn't make sense. I checked the tape, the machine, everything, but the recording was gone. It was as if it had never been there. I sat in the dark studio, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up. Maybe it was a prank, an elaborate hoax. But why would my boss have it? Why ask me to clean it up? Something wasn't right. The next day at work, I didn't say anything. I kept the tape to myself, unsure of how to explain it. When my boss asked about the cleaning, I lied and said there was nothing to fix. He didn't press, but I noticed something odd. His glasses, thick and black, almost like the man from the recording. It was just a coincidence. I convinced myself of that. That night, after leaving work, I decided to head straight home. But as I walked down the street, I saw a man standing across the street staring at me. He was wearing glasses, thick, dark glasses that made his face look oddly distant, obscured. The same glasses as the man from the tape. I froze. My heart raced. Was it him? Had the woman been talking about him? I quickly turned down a side alley, walking faster. The footsteps behind me echoed, growing louder. The man was following me. I broke into a run, my breath coming out in panicked gasps. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, keeping his distance but never breaking pace. Finally, I reached my building. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me, gasping for air. But through the window, I could see him still standing across the street. His gaze was locked on me. He didn't move. Hours passed, and I stayed inside, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But then, I noticed something else. There, on my kitchen counter, was the tape. The same faded cassette, the same label. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't brought it home. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity before slowly walking toward it. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. I didn't want to play it. I didn't want to hear that voice again. But I had to know. I put it in the recorder. This time, the voice was clearer than ever, right from the start. You shouldn't have listened. I didn't even need to hear more. I could feel it, the weight of whatever was in the recording pressing in on me. The man with the glasses hadn't left. He was here, in the room with me. I turned around, heart pounding. The room was empty, but the silence felt wrong, too quiet, too suffocating. And then I heard the sound of footsteps. They were coming closer. It began as a harmless dare. My friends and I were walking home late one night when we passed the old train station on the edge of town. It had been abandoned for decades, its tracks overgrown with weeds, its windows boarded up. The place was a relic, forgotten and avoided. "You know the story," Jake said, grinning. "They say if you stand on the platform at midnight, the train will come. But it's not for the living." Emma rolled her eyes. "Please, that's just a stupid urban legend." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Prove it. Midnight's in 20 minutes. I hesitated, staring at the crumbling station. The air around it felt wrong, heavy. I didn't believe in ghost stories, but something about the challenge made my skin crawl. "Let's do it," I said finally. We climbed over the rusted gate and made our way to the platform. The station was eerily silent. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Moonlight cast long shadows, and the air felt colder here, as if the place itself rejected warmth. We stood on the cracked concrete, shivering. The tracks stretched endlessly into the darkness, disappearing into the night. "See?" Emma said. "Nothing to worry about." Jake checked his watch. "Just wait, 2 minutes to midnight." The minutes dragged. The longer we stood there, the heavier the air became, like we were sinking into some unseen void. Then, at exactly midnight, it happened. The faint sound of a train whistle echoed through the air. We froze. Emma laughed nervously. "It's just the wind." But then we felt it. A low vibration beneath our feet, like the ground was alive. A light appeared in the distance, growing brighter, cutting through the darkness like a knife. "That's impossible," I whispered. The light came closer, and the sound of grinding metal filled the air. A train emerged from the shadows, its cars black and glinting like polished obsidian. It wasn't like any train I'd ever seen. Its windows were dark, its wheels emitting a strange rhythmic hum. It glided to a stop in front of us, silent now except for the hiss of steam. The doors slid open. Inside, the train was dimly lit, its seats lined with figures. At first, I thought they were mannequins. Still, silent, their faces blank. But then, one turned its head. Its eyes were hollow sockets, its skin pale and stretched tightly over its bones. Slowly, the others began to move, their heads tilting toward us, their eyeless gazes locked on our group. "We should leave," Emma whispered, backing away. But Jake stepped closer. "No way. This has to be a trick. Some prank." "Jake, don't," I said, grabbing his arm. Too late. A figure emerged from the train, a tall man in a conductor's uniform, his face shadowed by a cap. He held out a hand, his voice low and chilling. "Tickets, please." "We don't have tickets," Emma stammered, her voice barely audible. The conductor tilted his head. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 slips of paper. He extended them toward us. "For you?" I don't know why, but my hand moved on its own, reaching for the ticket. The paper was cold, almost wet, and as I stared at it, words began to form. My name appeared, scrawled in ink that seemed to seep into the page. "Get on," the conductor said, his voice now echoing. Unnaturally, I shook my head, dropping the ticket. "No, we're leaving." The conductor stepped closer, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the platform. The figures inside the train began to rise from their seats, their movements jerky, unnatural. Emma grabbed my arm. "Run!" We turned, and bolted, Jake close behind us. The train let out a deafening whistle, and I felt the ground tremble as if the station itself was about to collapse. Behind us, the conductor's voice rang out, deep and guttural. "You can't outrun it. Your ticket is already punched." We didn't stop running until we were back on the main road. The station was silent again, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked at my hand, I saw the faint outline of the ticket's ink, still etched into my skin. None of us speak about that night. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the faint whistle of a train in the distance, even when there are no tracks nearby, and I know it's coming for me. It started on an ordinary evening, one that seemed destined to be nothing more than a quiet night at home. My apartment overlooked a busy city street, the kind of place where the noise never truly stops. The glow from streetlights and the distant hum of traffic usually provided a sense of safety, but that night was different. It was nearing midnight, and I was sitting on the couch, flicking through channels, unable to focus on any one thing. A low rumble of thunder rumbled in the distance, barely audible over the city's usual buzz. I paused, glancing out the window. The sky was dark, the clouds heavy, but the rain hadn't begun yet. The apartment felt empty, the only sound being the occasional creak of the old floorboards. I figured I'd be heading to bed soon, when there was a faint knock at the door. At first I dismissed it as nothing, but then it came again, soft, almost hesitant. My heart skipped a beat. I stood, my hands clammy, and approached the door cautiously. No one usually comes knocking at midnight in the city. I peeked through the peephole. Nothing but darkness. No figure, no silhouette. Just the empty hallway. Maybe it was a neighbor, I reasoned. Someone lost or needing help. I opened the door a crack, but there was no one there. Just the quiet of the hallway. I locked the door again, shrugging it off. Maybe someone had gotten the wrong apartment. I turned back to the couch, but the unease stuck to me like a second skin. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the muted glow of the TV, but the nagging sensation of being watched refused to leave. A few minutes passed, and I heard it again, knocking, but this time it was different. It was slower, more deliberate, like someone was trying to make sure I heard it. I gritted my teeth and went back to the door, this time standing farther back as I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty as far as I could see, but now there was a faint outline, barely visible against the dim light from the street. A figure, motionless, standing at the far end. I could barely make out the details, but I knew it wasn't moving. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the figure, unable to look away. The knock came again. 3 distinct hollow raps. The figure didn't move. It stood there, still as a statue, as though waiting for something. Terror gripped me. I didn't know what to do. Calling the police seemed useless. What could they do? Tell me there's someone outside who won't leave? I backed away from the door, my body trembling. The knocking continued, slower now, as though the person, or whatever it was inching closer. The figure in the hallway remained, unmoving. Then, silence. The knocking stopped. I didn't hear it leave. I didn't hear footsteps retreating. It was just gone. The silence stretched out for what felt like hours. I waited, holding my breath, my back pressed against the wall. Eventually, I mustered the courage to peek through the blinds, but the hallway was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched remained. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing there, waiting, motionless. Even now, years later, I sometimes wonder if it's still out there waiting for someone, just not me. It was supposed to be just another ordinary evening at home, the kind of evening where you sit on the couch zoning out in front of the flickering TV while the world outside hums along like always. But that night was anything but ordinary. I had just finished a long day, feeling exhausted and ready to relax. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint sound of the wind outside rattling the window. The neighbors' usual sounds, the creak of floorboards above me, the muffled conversations. Through the thin walls were all as familiar as ever. I didn't think twice about it, too tired to care. At some point, though, I started to notice something strange. A subtle shift in the usual background noise, a faint, uneven breathing that didn't belong to me. I froze, sitting up straighter, listening harder. It wasn't coming from the TV or any of my usual appliances. It wasn't static. It was close, too close. I turned off the TV, the silence growing deafening. The only sound now was that breathing. Slow, steady, as if someone were right behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. Just the dim light from the hallway. My pulse quickened, but I told myself I was being paranoid. The apartment felt empty, the familiar creak of floorboards upstairs seeming just a little louder now. I told myself it was the wind, the old building settling. Still, the breathing didn't stop. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator answered, asking if I was safe. I wanted to tell her I was, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. Then, a soft knock echoed from the front door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I listened as the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. My heart pounded in my chest as I considered what to do. There was no way I could ignore it. Slowly, I stood and approached the door, my hand hovering over the lock. I peeked through the peephole, but there was no one there. Just the empty hallway. I pulled back, the sound of breathing still echoing softly behind me. It felt like someone was right there, just inches away. That's when I heard the knocking again, this time closer. It wasn't at the door anymore. It was coming from inside the apartment, from inside my walls. I ran to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. My phone was still on, the 911 operator still asking questions, but I couldn't answer. I could hear the breathing now, muffled but unmistakable, coming from behind the walls. It was as if someone had somehow found a way inside, but I couldn't see them. The knocking continued, growing louder, more frantic. My walls trembled with each thud. I could feel the vibrations under my feet. My mind raced, every rational thought abandoning me. I wanted to scream, to run, but fear held me still. Then, silence. The operator was still on the line, whispering, "Are you still there?" But there was nothing I could say. The only sound was my shallow breaths. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard it, the faintest creak, just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, heart thudding against my ribs. The door handle twisted, slowly turning. I backed away from the door, phone still in hand. My fingers trembled as I prayed that whoever, or whatever, was out there would leave. But then, a voice. Soft, distant, almost like a whisper, but clear enough to make me shiver. "I can hear you." I didn't move. I didn't answer. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body couldn't respond. The door creaked open, and for a moment, everything was still. Then a figure appeared, just a shadow in the dim light. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its face was indistinct, but I could see hollow, empty eyes, void of any life. It took a step closer, and I realized, in that frozen instant, that it wasn't something from this world. And then, it vanished. I didn't sleep that night. I don't know if I'll ever forget what I saw. But what haunts me more than anything is knowing that whatever was there, whatever it was never really gone. We didn't know what we were walking into. The old apartment building stood in the heart of the city, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. The landlord had been eager to rent it out despite the whispers of its dark history. After months of searching for a place, we were desperate. It seemed like the perfect fit. The apartment itself was cramped, walls cracked with age, and a lingering musty smell that no amount of cleaning could eradicate. We didn't mind at first. Desperation had a way of dulling the senses. But as we settled in, things began to feel off. It started small. The lights flickered late at night, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, even though we knew no one else lived in the building. There were no neighbors to hear or investigate. Still, we chalked it up to old wiring or perhaps creaky floors settling over time. That's what we told ourselves. Then, the dreams began. Every night, the same dream. A dark figure standing at the edge of my bed, watching silently. Its presence filled the room, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest until I couldn't breathe. Every night, I woke up gasping, only to find the figure was gone, but the oppressive sensation lingered. One evening, Emma said something that froze me to the bone. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. We were sitting in the living room, the window partially open to let in the cool breeze. But beyond the glass there was a faint hum. Low, distorted, almost mechanical. It grew louder, closer, until the sound was overwhelming. It wasn't coming from outside, it seemed to be emanating from the walls themselves. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I didn't hear anything." Emma's eyes widened as she stared at me, her voice trembling. "It's getting louder. Listen." The hum became unbearable, like a malfunctioning machine deep within the building, something dark and twisted that shouldn't exist. We covered our ears, trying to block it out, but it felt like the sound was inside our very skulls, vibrating through our bones. Then came the whispers. Quiet at first, so soft that they seemed to drift in the corners of our minds. But soon, they morphed into full sentences, and they were speaking directly to us. "Get out." The voice wasn't just in our heads, it was in the room. I felt its breath on my neck, cold and sharp. It was close, too close. "Run," the voice said again, deeper this time, colder, more commanding. We tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The locks jammed, as if something unseen had seized control. The windows, once our only escape route, were shattered. Fragments of glass scattered across the floor. There was no way out. The whispers grew louder, overlapping now, filling the space until we couldn't think straight. They whispered of forgotten deeds, of souls trapped, unable to rest. The dark figure from my dreams materialized in the room, standing in front of us, its eyes empty, voids of darkness that devoured all light. "We're not alone," Emma whispered, her voice quivering. The figure stepped closer, and we could feel its chilling presence. The air grew colder, too cold. Every breath we took was like inhaling ice. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I stared into its lifeless eyes. "We don't belong here," Ryan said, his voice strained. The entity tilted its head, an unnatural movement before it spoke again, its voice weaving between us like a dark web. Escape is futile. Desperation surged through us. I shouted, screaming into the void, but the whispers swallowed my voice. Emma clawed at the walls, desperate to tear through them, while Ryan pounded on the windows, even as shards cut into his hands. But nothing worked. The presence only grew stronger. Suddenly, as if waking from a nightmare, the hum stopped. The whispers ceased. The dark figure blinked once, its eyes flickering as if coming to consciousness. The entire apartment fell silent. We didn't waste a second. Without speaking, we bolted through the hallway, shoving open doors, desperate for any exit. And there it was, a small back staircase hidden in the shadows. We fled down it, falling over each other in our haste, ignoring the burning in our legs. At the bottom, we burst into the alley, breathless and alive. The city seemed normal again. Noise, light, movement. But we didn't stop. We kept running, heart pounding in sync with the chaos that had just unfolded. When we dared to look back, the building was empty, still and undisturbed, like it had never happened. No signs of life, no trace of the horrors we experienced. We never spoke of what had transpired that night again. The apartment had become our shared nightmare, something too impossible to comprehend, let alone explain. To this day, we avoid that part of the city. We don't know what still lingers there, and honestly, we don't want to find out. It was a rare invitation, one that didn't come often. An old friend's beach house, far from the busy city, offered to us for the weekend. The house was tucked away along the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast, endless ocean. There were no neighbors, no nearby towns, just the house and the sea. We were the only ones for miles. At first glance, the house seemed idyllic. Whitewashed walls, weathered wooden beams, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the crashing waves below. It was a place made for quiet escapes, the kind of serenity that draws you in. But something felt off. The ocean was beautiful, sure, but there was an unnatural stillness to it. No seagulls, no crashing waves, just a quiet, eerie roar that seemed to echo endlessly. We chalked it up to being far from any usual signs of life, but that gnawing feeling didn't leave. On the first night, things began to shift. We sat by the fire, the sound of the ocean roaring below like a constant reminder that we were isolated. At first, it was subtle, the sound of footsteps on the deck, soft, almost imperceptible. We ignored it, assuming the wind was playing tricks on us, but the wind never sounded like that. Just the house settling, Ryan said. Emma and I nodded in agreement, but there was an edge to his voice, a flicker of doubt we couldn't ignore. By the second night, the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. We couldn't ignore them anymore. They were slow, deliberate, circling the house like something was inspecting us. When we would rush to the windows, the deck below was empty. Nothing but the waves crashing far below. Could be an animal, Emma suggested. But animals don't walk in that way. Calm and measured. Whatever it wasn't outside. That's when the whispers began. Soft at first, as if they were carried in on the wind, but as the night wore on, they became clearer. Not just whispering, but a voice. A deep, hollow voice that seemed to echo inside my head. Go away. I looked around the room, but neither Ryan nor Emma had heard it, or at least they wouldn't admit to it. It's nothing, Ryan said again, his voice uneasy. Just the ocean. But it wasn't. The voice came back, clearer this time, stronger. Leave. I could feel it in my bones. Something was in the house with us. Something that didn't want us there. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper that came from nowhere, kept us awake. It felt like the house itself was alive, watching us, waiting for the right moment. At dawn, I woke to a cold, oppressive silence. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath, waiting for something to break it. I wandered to the windows, hoping for a glimpse of the ocean, but instead my eyes fell on something far worse. Standing just beyond the window, I saw a figure, tall, shadowy, its shape distorted by the mist and the morning fog. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to breathe. It just stared, its hollow eyes locked on me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't look away. It felt like time had stopped. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and waved, just once. I didn't wait for it to do anything else. I bolted from the room, heart racing, finding Ryan and Emma in the living room, staring at the same window. "It's here," I gasped. "It's still here." Their eyes were wide, but neither of them spoke. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen. The whispers came again, louder now. This time, we couldn't ignore them. "Leave now," panic set in. We grabbed our things, not daring to stay another moment. The house felt alive, like it was holding us there against our will. As we stepped outside, the figure was gone. The ocean roared louder than ever, as if it too had been waiting for us to leave. We've never been back to that house. The whispers still haunt me, and sometimes when I'm by the sea, I can still feel the weight of that stare. Whatever was there, it's still waiting. The summer evening was warm, the kind of heat that lingers even as the sun dips below the horizon. We decided to go on a hike that day, something none of us had done in a while. There were 5 of us, old friends, eager to reconnect and enjoy the fresh air. The trail led us deep into the woods, far from any signs of civilization. The trees loomed overhead, their thick canopies blocking most of the sunlight, leaving the forest in a perpetual shade. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional rustling of branches. We hadn't seen another person since we parked the car hours ago. The isolation felt serene, almost perfect. But something felt off. It wasn't, until we were several miles into the hike that I noticed it. The trees started feeling closer together, the trail growing narrower. It wasn't just the forest pressing in. The atmosphere felt heavier, like something was watching us from the shadows. I brushed it off at first. Maybe the isolation was starting to get to me. But then, one by one, the others began to notice it too. The silence wasn't just peaceful anymore, it was oppressive. My friend Sarah stopped suddenly, turning to the rest of us with wide eyes. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice trembling. We all nodded, uneasy now. The air felt colder, the trees rustling more erratically. It was as if the forest had taken on a life of its own. My other friend, Jack, pulled out his phone, checking for signal, but there was nothing. Not even a faint bar. "Let's keep going," I suggested, trying to stay calm. But deep down, I knew we shouldn't have. As we pressed forward, the forest seemed to tighten its grip. The trail became harder to follow, winding, deeper into the unknown. The trees grew taller, their branches reaching out like clawed fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that didn't belong in the woods. It was when we came to a clearing that things took a darker turn. The trees around us seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, their shadows shifting in ways that defied the laws of light. In the center of the clearing was an old, weathered wooden bench, completely out of place. The air felt even colder now, and I could see my breath in front of me, though it wasn't that cold. "Let's sit for a minute," someone suggested, and we all hesitated but agreed. The bench creaked as we sat down, its splinters digging into my legs. It felt ancient, like it had been there long before any of us. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, something out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned, I saw it more clearly. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, cloaked in shadows. I couldn't make out any features, only the impression of something tall and gaunt. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice cracking. But there was no response. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. "Guys, we need to go," Sarah said, panic creeping into her voice. The rest of us didn't argue. We grabbed our things and started walking quickly, keeping our eyes fixed ahead, but the feeling of being followed didn't leave. The figure was still there, always just out of reach. Every time we looked back, it seemed closer, as though it was always trailing us. We didn't stop again, even as night began to fall. The forest grew darker, but the figure stayed with us, a constant, silent presence. Eventually, we stumbled out of the woods, back to the car. We didn't speak much on the drive home, each of us lost in our thoughts. It wasn't until the next day that I looked back at the photos I took on the hike. One picture caught my attention: the clearing, the old bench, and in the background, faint and distorted, was that figure. Its eyes were the only thing visible, hollow and empty, staring back at me. It was supposed to be a simple day at the beach, the kind where the sun beats down, the sound of waves is constant, and nothing seems out of place. My friends and I decided to take a trip to a secluded beach we'd heard about, far from the crowded tourist spots. We packed coolers, sunscreen, and our usual beach gear, eager for some peace and quiet. The beach was vast, rocky, and stretched out for miles. It felt like we were the only ones there, which was exactly what we'd wanted. We spent the day lounging, swimming, and talking. The water was refreshing, the sand soft beneath our feet, and the sense of isolation only added to the charm of the place. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the rocks, we decided to stay a little longer, hoping to watch the sun dip below the horizon. The air was warm and thick, but something about the silence unsettled me. It wasn't just the absence of other people. There was something else, something in the atmosphere that felt wrong. As the sun disappeared, the sky turned a deep purple and the horizon shimmered with orange streaks. We were packing our things when one of my friends, Lisa, stopped and pointed toward the edge of the beach. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. We all turned. Standing at the far end of the beach, barely visible in the fading light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, cloaked in darkness, its outline blending with the shadows of the cliffs. At first, we thought it might be someone hiking the cliffs, but they weren't moving. They stood there, motionless, watching us. "Maybe it's someone camping," one of my other friends suggested. But there weren't any campsites around, just endless rocks and cliffs stretching into the distance. We watched for what felt like forever, but the figure didn't move. It was like a statue, unmoving and silent. A chill ran down my spine. The more we stared, the more I felt like it was staring back at us, like we were the ones being watched. Lisa started to take a step forward, her curiosity overpowering her fear. "We should check," she said softly. "Maybe it's just someone lost." I wanted to argue, to tell her to stay put, but the silence and stillness of the figure were too eerie. We followed her, our steps hesitant on the uneven rocks. The closer we got, the more details we could make out. It wasn't human. It didn't have a face, at least, not in the way we expected. Its head was hollow, like an empty mask, and its limbs were too long and thin, twisted at unnatural angles. "Let's get back," I urged, my voice shaking. But before we could turn, the figure began to move. Slowly, methodically, like it was gliding rather than walking. "Run!" I shouted, my fear overcoming me. But before any of us could, the figure had closed the distance between us. Its hand, if you could call it that, reached out, long and bony, and touched Lisa's shoulder. Her scream echoed across the empty beach, but it wasn't the scream of someone in terror. It was hollow, lifeless. I didn't stop running until I was far away, back at the edge of the beach, gasping for breath. My friends followed, but Lisa wasn't with them. I turned back once, but she was gone. That night, as we sat huddled in silence, I couldn't stop thinking about Lisa. The figure, whatever it was, had taken her. I knew we'd never find her again. And as I stared at the dark horizon, I knew that we weren't the only ones left watching. It was supposed to be a simple day at the park, nothing unusual. Just me, my camera, and a quiet trail leading into the woods. I've always been fond of nature and spent my weekends hiking or exploring different paths, searching for something unique to capture on film. That morning, I packed my camera gear and set out early. The air was crisp and the sun was barely peeking over the horizon when I arrived at the trailhead. It was a familiar spot, but this time something felt off. The usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves were missing. Instead, there was silence, the kind that hangs heavy, as if the world itself had gone still. I took a deep breath and shrugged it off, telling myself I was imagining things. As I followed the trail deeper into the woods, the quiet only grew. The trees seemed taller, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The path became narrower, winding between thick undergrowth. I kept walking, ignoring the unease growing in my chest. At one point, I stopped to take a photo. I raised my camera and glanced through the lens. What I saw wasn't the usual forest scene. There was something there, something moving just beyond, the edge of the frame. A figure, tall and obscured by the trees, watching me. My hands shook as I lowered the camera, but when I looked, there was nothing there. I kept moving, trying to push the thought away, but every step felt heavier. The Uik trail began to thin, and the trees loomed larger, as if they were closing in on me. I glanced behind, but all I could see was the empty path I had come from. I walked until I reached a small clearing, bathed in the dim light filtering through the canopy. It was peaceful, the kind of moment you wish could last forever. But something about the stillness unsettled me. I felt like I was being watched. I set my camera down on a rock and took a seat, staring at the trees that surrounded me. Then I noticed something. A faint whisper, almost inaudible. I strained my ears, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was just the wind, until it came again, louder this time. Not quite a whisper, not quite a voice, but something close enough to make my skin crawl. I grabbed my camera and began to snap pictures, hoping to capture whatever it was. The shutter clicked again and again, but when I reviewed the images, there was nothing but the forest. A rustling noise came from behind, and I turned sharply, expecting to see an animal. Instead, there was nothing, just the trees, still and unmoving. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was alone. Or so I thought. I heard it again. Closer this time. The faint sound of footsteps crunching leaves. I turned slowly, my camera raised, but there was still nothing in sight. The sound continued, steady and deliberate, circling the clearing. Panic surged through me as I realized I wasn't imagining it. The footsteps weren't from an animal. They were from something else. I stumbled backward, keeping my eyes on the trees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, moving between the trees. Its form was distorted, barely human, but I could feel its presence. Its eyes, if it even had them, were black voids, staring straight at me. I turned and ran. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible, the sound of those footsteps growing louder behind me. The trees blurred into streaks of green and brown, but I didn't dare stop. My camera swung wildly as I pushed through thorns and branches, the fear coursing through me like electricity. When I finally broke free from the trees, I didn't stop to look back. I ran to my car, throwing open the door and slamming it shut. Behind me, the silence of the forest was replaced by the steady hum of the engine, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I sat there, hands trembling on the steering wheel, staring at the woods. The figure, whatever it was, had disappeared, but I knew it was still out there, waiting just beyond my sight. It was the middle of summer, and my friends and I decided to take a day trip to a remote beach, far from the usual tourist spots. We wanted to escape the crowds and find some quiet, peaceful place to relax. The beach wasn't well known, tucked away down a narrow, winding road, hidden from the rest of the world. We arrived in the early afternoon, greeted by nothing but the endless stretch of sand and the gentle lapping of waves. The sky was clear, the sun blazing overhead. The beach, stretched out before us, empty except for a few distant figures far off in the distance. It was perfect. We set up our towels, spread out some chairs, and spent the day swimming, talking, and soaking up the sun. The water was warm, the air salty and fresh. It felt like paradise, away from the noise and rush of everyday life. But as the sun began to dip closer to the horizon, something started to feel off. The air seemed to grow heavier, and a strange quiet had settled over the beach. Even the waves seemed quieter, like they were retreating, leaving behind an eerie stillness. My friends didn't seem to notice, too lost in their own conversations, but I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, an instinctive warning that something wasn't right. I wandered a little closer to the water, scanning the horizon. That's when I saw them. Two figures standing at the edge of the ocean, staring out at nothing. They weren't moving, weren't even talking, just standing there as if they were waiting for something. I didn't want to believe it, but as I moved closer, I could see their faces. They weren't like us. Their eyes were hollow, dark, and empty. There was something wrong with their skin, too. Pale, almost translucent, as though they didn't belong in the sunlight. They turned slightly, as if sensing my gaze, but didn't. Look at me. Their attention remained fixed on the horizon. I felt a wave of panic rising, my breath quickening. I turned and ran back to my friends, my heart thudding in my chest. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Now!" They laughed it off, thinking I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling of those figures standing there, their eyes lifeless, their faces twisted in a way I couldn't understand. As we packed up our things and started heading back, the silence followed us. The beach was still empty, the distant figures still watching us, their presence growing more and more oppressive. I glanced back one last time, and that's when I noticed something terrifying. The figures weren't there anymore, but I could still feel their gaze on me. It was supposed to be just an ordinary evening trip, something to break the monotony of everyday life. My friends and I decided to take the old winding road through the countryside, a place none of us had visited before. The idea was simple: leave behind the city's noise and escape into the quiet, untouched beauty of nature. The drive was uneventful at first. The road stretched ahead, snaking between tall, overgrown fields that swayed gently in the evening breeze. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and we were lost in conversation, laughing about everything and nothing. The GPS kept pointing us forward, leading us deeper into the unknown. But then the air changed. The atmosphere became thicker, heavier. The trees began to crowd the road, their branches meeting high above like twisted fingers. It felt like we were descending into a different world, one untouched by time. We came to a bend in the road, and that's when it happened. The car jolted, the engine sputtering as it suddenly lost power. I steered to the side, the tires crunching against the gravel. The road was empty, and there was nothing for miles except endless forest. We tried to restart the car, but it was no use. The engine made a low, guttural sound and then gave up entirely. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. "We'll walk to the nearest town," someone suggested, but none of us were sure where that even was. We decided to stay put, hoping someone would pass by and offer help. Our phones were useless, no signal, no bars. It grew darker, and soon the only light came from the dying glow of the car's headlights. We sat in silence, passing around a flashlight to keep the shadows at bay. The woods felt alive. Every creak and crack of the branches was magnified, as if something were watching us. I don't know how much time had passed when we heard it, the sound of footsteps, not from the direction of the forest, but behind us. We froze, holding our breath. The footsteps were slow, measured, like they didn't belong to anyone we knew. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just the soft crunch of shoes on gravel. The sound got closer, and then, to my horror, we saw them. A group of figures walking toward us from the darkness. They didn't run, didn't seem scared or worried. They moved like shadows, their faces obscured by the night, their footsteps steady and unwavering. "Who are you?" someone whispered, but the figures didn't respond. They just kept coming. The flashlight's beam swept over them, revealing details that chilled us to the bone. They were wearing mismatched, tattered clothes, faces void of expression. Their eyes weren't hollow. There was nothing behind them at all. They weren't human, not anymore. Panic surged through us as they stopped, standing in a silent circle around the car. They didn't speak, didn't react to our screams. They just stared, as though they were waiting for something. We knew we couldn't run. There was no point in screaming. We could only sit and hope they would leave, but the longer they stood there, the more I realized they weren't going anywhere. Then, one of them, barely more than a shadow, stepped forward. It wasn't one of the figures we had seen before. This one was different. It was taller, thinner, its limbs stretched unnaturally. It moved with a jerky, unsettling gait, like it didn't quite fit in its own body. It stared at us with cold, black eyes, and for a moment, I swear, it smiled. Not a human smile, but something inhuman, sharp, toothless, and utterly devoid of life. Time seemed to stretch as we sat there, trapped in the gaze of those empty eyes. The air grew colder, heavier. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned my head, away, unable to bear the sight. When I looked back, they were gone. The figures, the strange figure, they were all gone. The forest was silent again, the only sound being the rustle of leaves carried by the wind. We didn't stay. We didn't look back. We ran, screaming into the night, not stopping until we reached the edge of town and found help. I don't know what they were or where they came from. I don't think I ever want to know. All I know is that some things should remain hidden, buried deep in the shadows of forgotten places. It was just another ordinary Saturday, or at least I thought it would be. I decided to spend the day exploring the old, forgotten part of town that no one really visited anymore. The streets were lined with buildings that had long since fallen into disrepair, their facades cracked and faded from years of neglect. Nobody seemed to come here anymore, which was exactly why I wanted to see it. I wandered aimlessly, the silence enveloping me like a thick, oppressive fog. The air smelled stale, full of dust and decay. Most of the windows in the buildings were shattered, letting in the muted light of the day that barely managed to penetrate the grime. There was an unsettling stillness, a quiet that felt almost alive. I tried to push away the creeping sense of discomfort, reminding myself that it was just an old part of town, nothing more. As I walked, I came across an old bookstore, its window cracked and its door hanging loosely on one hinge. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of old paper and mildew. Dust covered every surface and cobwebs stretched from the corners of the ceiling. The place was like a museum, untouched by time. I wandered between the shelves, the weight of the silence pressing on my shoulders. The only sound was the soft shuffle of my footsteps on the creaking floorboards. Every so often, I'd hear a faint creak or the distant echo of my own breathing, but that was all. It felt like I had stepped into a world that had long since forgotten life. Suddenly, something shifted in the shadows. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A whispering sound echoed through the empty space, quiet and subtle. I turned around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing. Just more rows of old, dusty books. "Hello." My voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the silence. No response. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight flickering as I moved deeper into the store. The whispering came again, louder this time, like a breath on the back of my neck. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second I thought I saw something move, a shadow at the end of the aisle. I followed the beam of light, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The store was filled with rows upon rows of books, each one older than the last. The whispering continued, low and haunting, as if it were coming from the depths of the building itself. I walked toward the back of the store, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The whispers grew louder, now more like faint murmurs, as though something was speaking to me in a language I couldn't understand. My pulse quickened as I realized the sound wasn't coming from a book, or the wind, or anything tangible. Then I saw it. A figure, faint, barely visible in the dim light. It stood near the far wall, its form indistinct, almost transparent. My breath hitched, and my flashlight flickered once more, casting shadows that danced along the walls. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. The whispers grew louder, merging into a chorus of faint, distorted voices. I took a hesitant step toward it, my hand shaking as I tried to focus my flashlight. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. The figure vanished, as if it had never been there. My chest tightened as I searched the darkness, but there was nothing. The store felt colder now, empty in a way that felt almost unnatural. I decided to leave. I didn't care about the books anymore, or the eerie feeling that had taken over the space. I just wanted to get out. As I made my way to the front door, I could feel eyes watching me, following me. My footsteps quickened, the creaking floorboards beneath me sounding louder than they had all day. When I finally reached the door, I paused, one last glance over my shoulder, just to be sure I was alone. That's when I saw it. The figure again, just beyond the doorway, standing in the shadows. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt as though it could see straight through me. Then it was gone. I stepped outside, the door slamming shut behind me. The whispering was gone, replaced by silence once more. I didn't look back. I never went back to that bookstore, and I never will. Some places leave scars that can't be erased. I've always been a night owl. I'd spend hours driving back roads, listening to music, or just getting lost in thought. One night, I decided to take a different route home, one that looped through fields and quiet country roads. It was the kind of night where the stars felt closer, the sky so vast and clear it seemed to stretch forever. Around 2 a.m., I found myself on a lonely stretch of road, surrounded by nothing but farmland. The fields stretched out on either side of me, empty and dark, with only the occasional flicker of distant farmhouses. I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt, isolated but serene. That's when I saw it. A figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a scarecrow. The silhouette was tall and thin, almost too thin, with its arms outstretched like it was waving. I slowed down as I approached, my headlights illuminating it. But it wasn't a scarecrow. It had a face, long, gaunt, and pale, like something that had been buried for years. Its hollow eyes didn't blink, didn't seem to recognize me. It stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something. I was frozen, unable to move. The figure didn't shift, didn't run. It just stood there, watching me. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, but nothing happened. My car idled, the engine humming softly. Then, just as I was about to drive away, it moved. Not toward me, but away. It turned slowly and walked into the fields, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing. What had I seen? A hallucination? A prank? I drove home that night, my hands trembling on the wheel, but I couldn't forget the image, the figure. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something that felt rooted in the very land itself. Even now, years later, I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the fields, waiting for someone to cross its path again. I'll never forget the day I visited that old bookstore. It was tucked away on a quiet street, surrounded by tall, crumbling brick buildings that leaned toward one another as though the city had forgotten about them. The windows of the bookstore were dusty and covered in fog, but something about it drew me in. It wasn't the kind of place people normally wandered into, but I found myself stepping through the creaking wooden door without hesitation. The bell above rang faintly, and the smell of old paper and dust hit me all at once. The place felt as though it had been untouched for decades. Bookshelves stretched high above my head, the spines old and faded. The light from the single bulb overhead flickered weakly. I wandered through the narrow aisles, trailing my fingers along the spines of the forgotten books, half expecting to hear the whispers of some long-lost ghostly stories. I picked up a few, old paperbacks, flipping through pages that crinkled in my hands. Something about the silence and the musty air felt almost otherworldly. I lost track of time, losing myself in the thick atmosphere of the store. At the end of one aisle, I found a shelf that seemed different from the rest. The books here were thinner, almost like pamphlets, their covers dark and worn. I pulled one from the shelf. Its title was barely legible: Whispers of the Forgotten. It wasn't the title that caught my attention, though. It was the strange sense of familiarity I felt as I opened it. The first few pages were scattered with strange symbols and text I couldn't read. I traced my fingers over them, my mind drawn to the obscure illustrations, twisted, distorted shapes that looked like they were from another world. I turned to the next page, and that's when I saw it. Words written in a language that wasn't English. They weren't letters, just strange symbols that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't stop reading, as though something was compelling me to continue. My hands trembled as I read the first few lines. "Those who seek will find, but they may not return." The words sent a cold wave through my body. I glanced around the bookstore, suddenly realizing how quiet it had become. The faint creak of the floorboards seemed to echo louder than it should have, and I could feel eyes on me. It was as though the store itself was watching, waiting. The room seemed darker now, shadows stretching toward me from the corners of the shelves. My heart raced as I looked back at the book. The pages turned by themselves, landing on a chapter that spoke of places that no longer existed. Forgotten towns, cities swallowed by time and silence. The more I read, the more I felt an odd connection to these places. It was as if I had been there before, even though I knew I hadn't. Suddenly, the light overhead flickered violently, casting everything into near darkness. A chill swept through the room, and I heard a whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. "Turn back." I froze, the whisper echoing in my ears. My eyes darted around the bookstore, but there was no one there. My breath came in shallow gasps as I realized I was alone. The pages of the book flipped again, this time stopping on a section titled "The Forgotten Path." My hands were shaking as I read, "The path is long and lonely, but those who seek will find. Beware, for what is lost may never be reclaimed." The room felt colder now, and I could hear the sound of footsteps, though no one was there. The air was thick, and it felt as though something was closing in on me. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, my mind consumed by the words of the book. It was then that I noticed something at the edge of my vision. A figure, tall, shadowy, and indistinct, stood at the end of the aisle, watching me. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Return. What is lost?" Panic set in, and I knew I had to get out. I stumbled backward, clutching the book tightly. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze following me as I hurried toward the door. As I ran out of the bookstore, The bell above rang once more, echoing into the night. I didn't look back. The streets outside were empty, silent, as though the city had swallowed the bookstore whole. I don't know what I brought with me from that place, but every night since I've dreamed of the figures and the whispers. There's a piece of that book still in my hands, and I wonder, will I ever be able to forget, or will I be drawn back seeking something I might not want to find? It was a scorching summer day when I decided to go for a drive. I'd always loved the open road. There was something freeing about it, something that made me feel alive. That's what I told myself, at least, as I packed some snacks and set off, not really knowing where I was headed. The sun beat down mercilessly, casting long shadows across the cracked, dusty roads. I didn't care about the destination, just the journey. Hours passed as I cruised through deserted country roads, the only sound being the low hum of my car and the occasional rustling of wind through the tall grass. As the sun began to set, I found myself driving past an old, long-forgotten cemetery. It was small, nestled between rolling hills and forgotten farmland, surrounded by a thick, weathered iron fence. The gate was hanging open, creaking slightly in the breeze. Something about it drew me in, though I wasn't sure why. I decided to stop, telling myself I was just curious. The cemetery was eerily silent, the headstones leaning at odd angles, barely readable beneath a thick layer of moss. I wandered through the rows of graves, each one worn and forgotten. The sunlight was fading fast, and I felt the oppressive quiet closing in around me. There was something wrong about this place. Not just the silence, but the way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if the light itself was bending around the graves. It wasn't until I stumbled upon an old, crumbling mausoleum that the feeling of unease became too much to ignore. The door hung open, rusted and creaking as if inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the faint smell of decay lingering in my nostrils. The walls were lined with faded, crumbling inscriptions, each name barely legible. I moved deeper into the darkness, my flashlight casting shaky beams across the space. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the room, unmoving. My breath caught in my throat as I froze. It wasn't human, not exactly. Its shape was twisted, features distorted in the dim light. Hollow eyes stared blankly at me, and I could see cracks running through its skin, almost as if it were made of clay that had been left to crack and decay. Who's there? My voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed unnaturally through the mausoleum. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me. The oppressive silence grew thicker, and I took a hesitant step back. The flashlight flickered, casting shifting shadows that danced around the walls, making the figure look more monstrous with every movement. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from those hollow, staring eyes. There was a low, grating sound, like gravel being dragged across stone, and suddenly the figure stepped closer. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I backed further into the shadows. My flashlight illuminated more of the room, revealing cracks in the floor, the walls, even in the ceiling above. It felt as though the very structure of the mausoleum was breaking apart. Then came the whisper, soft, barely audible, yet it seemed to echo in my head. You shouldn't be here. The voice wasn't human. It was deep, distorted, and came from all around me. I felt the weight of it pressing down on my chest as if the very air had grown heavier. My breath quickened and I forced myself to move, stumbling toward the door. But as I reached for it, I felt something cold and clammy brush against my arm. I spun around, the flashlight barely illuminating the space. The figure was right behind me now, closer than I had realized. It reached out, long, bony fingers extending, and I could see the cracks running across its skin, the same as the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It didn't need to speak again. I already knew it wasn't going to let me leave. I screamed, a sound that echoed off the cold, damp stone. But then, everything fell silent once more. When I woke, the sun was high in the sky, and the cemetery was silent as if nothing had ever happened. My car was parked where I'd left it, the gate still swinging gently in the breeze, but I didn't dare go back inside the mausoleum. I couldn't bring myself to. It was a summer evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old neighborhood park. The sun was just starting to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown trails. I had lived in this town my entire life, but I had always avoided this park, partly because it had a reputation, mostly forgotten now, of being haunted or unsettling. People used to talk about strange noises, whispers, and figures moving through the trees, but I never paid much attention to those stories. That night, though, I needed some quiet, some space to clear my head. The park wasn't far from my home, just a short walk away. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where the old oaks loomed over the trails and the air smelled thick with the scent of pine and earth. As I strolled down the main path, the woods on either side seemed darker than I remembered, the trees taller and more imposing. The usual sounds of the city were distant now, just the rustle of leaves and the faint hum of insects. The silence was unnerving, almost oppressive. I had a strange feeling, as though the forest itself was watching, waiting for something. I continued walking, my footsteps crunching softly against the gravel path. I passed by an old wooden bench, splintered and half-rotted, its paint chipped and faded. It had been there forever, the kind of thing no one really paid attention to anymore. But something about it caught my eye. A faint scratch, almost too faint to notice, ran down the bench's surface. The marks looked as if they'd been made by long, sharp claws. I paused for a moment, staring at the bench, my heart thudding harder. It couldn't have been anything natural. No animal could have left such clean, precise scratches. Maybe kids had vandalized it, but the deeper I looked, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of wrongness, as though those marks weren't meant to be there at all. I shook off the unease and kept walking, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I ventured further into the park, I noticed something strange. The trees weren't swaying with the breeze like they should have been. Instead, the branches hung motionless, as if the wind itself had vanished. Then came the sound. A low, raspy whisper carried by the stillness. It came from behind me, soft and indistinct, as though it had traveled from far away. I stopped, listening, but the whisper faded before I could make out any words. My stomach twisted into knots, and I forced myself to keep walking, faster now, as though I could outrun whatever had made that sound. As I turned a bend in the path, I saw something ahead, a figure partially obscured by the thick trees. It wasn't moving, just standing there, silhouetted against the last light of the setting sun. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't look human. Its outline was too tall, too lanky, with limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Shadows seemed to crawl along its body, swallowing it whole. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the longer I stared, the more I felt something stir inside me. A primal fear I couldn't explain. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't shift or move. It simply stood there, watching me. I forced myself to look away, to keep walking. But as I passed, I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. I clenched my fists, willing my legs to carry me faster. A rustling behind me snapped my attention back. I spun around, expecting to see nothing. But there it was again. The whisper, now louder, more insistent. It wasn't words, just fragments, like someone muttering in a language I didn't recognize. The figure was gone, but the trees seemed to bend toward me now, their branches brushing the path like fingers reaching out. The unease grew until it felt unbearable. I glanced down at my phone. No signal. Of course, there was nothing but static in this part of the park, and I had no way to call for help even if I wanted to. Suddenly, I heard the sound again, this time closer, closer than I'd ever imagined. It was right behind me now, following, breathing down my neck. My legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring into the woods, unable to tear my eyes away from the darkness that seemed to stretch forever. Who? Who's there? I whispered, my voice cracking. No answer. Just the whisper. Louder now, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything fell silent. The whisper, the rustling, the feeling of being watched. All of it disappeared. I didn't dare turn around. I kept walking, every step trembling beneath me. I didn't know if I was imagining it, but I could have sworn something was still there, hidden just beyond the edge of my vision. The park finally gave way to the street, and as I walked back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed. The whispers echoed in my ears, and I didn't dare look back. I've never gone back to the park. The night it happened, I was driving home from a late shift. I always took the same winding route through the countryside, cutting through deserted back roads that few ever traveled after dark. There's something unsettling about these roads. No streetlights, no signs of life, just miles of empty fields and trees on either side. It's the kind of place that always feels like it's hiding something. That night, the air was unusually cold, even for late October. The moon was almost full, casting a dim, eerie glow over everything. The silence was overwhelming. No cars, no distant sounds of animals, just the low hum of the tires on the cracked asphalt. I wasn't in a hurry to get home, so I kept my speed steady, the familiar stretch of road ahead seemingly endless. That's when I noticed something strange. In the distance, I saw a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was someone waiting for a ride, but there was something off about it. How still it was. How unnatural. I slowed down as I approached. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It was just standing there, its back to me. I could barely make out its shape in the dim light, but I could see enough to tell it wasn't human. Its form was too tall, too thin, like it didn't belong in this world. My heart began to race as I drove past, gripping the steering wheel tighter. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure still there. But it wasn't. I told myself I had imagined it, that the shadows had played tricks on my eyes. But then I saw it again, this time, closer. The same figure was standing at the edge of a field, facing me directly. Its silhouette was more distinct now, and I could make out its long, slender arms hanging limp at its sides. I wanted to turn around, to speed back the way I came, but something kept me driving forward. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel tighter, my breathing shallow. The figure stayed motionless, not moving even as I passed. It wasn't until I reached a stretch of road where the trees thinned out that I realized the figure had somehow crossed the road ahead of me. It was standing there, halfway between where I'd last seen it and my location. Panic surged through me. I had no idea what this thing was or how it kept appearing. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, speeding past it without looking back. But every nerve in my body screamed for me to stop. When I finally reached the outskirts of the town, the figure was gone. I drove the rest of the way home, trying to make sense of what I had seen. The figure had felt wrong. Too wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying what I had seen, convinced that whatever it wasn't something human. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. And I knew. I knew it wasn't done with me. It was supposed to be a simple day, just a quiet walk through the neighborhood. I lived in a suburban area, nothing unusual about it. I liked to take long walks after work to clear my head, the kind of walks where you don't think much about anything, just put one foot in front of the other, lost in your own thoughts. But that day, something felt off from the very beginning. The sky was overcast, casting a dull gray light over everything. The streets were empty, no kids playing, no cars passing by. It was eerily quiet, but I figured everyone must have been inside, waiting out the weather. I didn't think much of it, just kept walking, letting my mind wander. It wasn't until I passed the old abandoned house at the end of the street that the feeling of unease really sank in. The house had been empty for as long as I could remember. Worn-down shutters, a porch that creaked with every gust of wind. I always avoided it, always felt like something wasn't right about it. But this time, something about the atmosphere pulled me closer. I slowed my pace, staring at the house. It looked different, almost as if it had been watching me. The windows, once dark and empty, now seemed to gleam with an unsettling intensity. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw movement inside. I shook my head and told myself I was imagining things. As I took another step forward, I heard a sound, a soft whisper, too low to make out. My skin crawled. I stopped, trying to listen, but the world around me seemed unnaturally silent, almost as though the sound had been swallowed by the void. Then I saw it. A figure appeared in one of the upstairs windows, standing still. It was tall, obscured by the dim light, but there was something off about it. It wasn't a shadow. It felt more like a void, an absence of something rather than a presence. My breath caught as the figure tilted its head as if studying me. I should have turned and run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at it, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called that, seemed to peer directly into my soul. Seconds felt like hours. Then the figure turned and disappeared from the window. My legs felt like stone as I finally managed to take a step back, my mind screaming at me to leave. I stumbled away, never taking my eyes off the house. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, truly watched. The emptiness that had once filled the neighborhood now felt suffocating, like the world had become a void of silence and shadows. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind made my skin crawl. The thought of that figure still haunted me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. Something was there, watching, waiting, and it wasn't going to forget me. It was late October, the sky heavy with overcast clouds as we set off for a camping trip. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months, far away from the city, deep into the heart of a forest we'd never visited before. None of us had ever camped out this far from civilization, but the promise of quiet, untouched wilderness was too tempting. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon, the air crisp and carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. The campground was abandoned with no signs of other campers. The silence stretched out around us, broken only by the distant rustling of trees and the soft crunch of leaves beneath our feet. As we unpacked and set up our tents, the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trees. By the time night fell, we had a small fire going, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the ground. The forest stretched out before us, dark and vast, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of branches and the distant hoot of an owl. We sat around the fire, sharing stories, laughing, and drinking. The tension from the city life seemed to melt away as we relaxed under the canopy of stars. But even in the quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The forest seemed too still, too quiet. It wasn't just peaceful, it was eerily quiet. Around midnight, I decided to check the area beyond our campsite. Something about the woods felt off, as though they were holding their breath. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured a little further into the trees. The ground was soft and uneven beneath my feet, and the only light came from my flashlight's dim beam. I walked for what felt like hours, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting into the darkness. The deeper I went, the stronger the feeling that I was being watched. My heartbeat quickened and I stopped, shining the light around. There was nothing but trees, shadows, and the faint creak of the wind. But then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible figure in the distance. It wasn't human. It was tall and slender, standing motionless. My breath hitched, and I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, unmoving. I turned and ran back to camp, my legs carrying me as fast as they could. When I returned, my friends were asleep, blissfully unaware of the presence I had felt. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the memory of that figure stayed with me. The next morning, we packed up quickly and decided to head back to civilization. None of us spoke about what I had seen. I was too afraid they wouldn't believe me. As we walked back, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again, but the forest was silent, as though it had never been disturbed. Even now, years later, I wonder what it was I saw that night. Whatever it was, I know I wasn't alone in the forest. It was a crisp autumn evening when I decided to take a solo drive through the countryside. The road stretched on endlessly, flanked by trees that were shedding their leaves, casting long, eerie shadows under the fading sunlight. I always enjoyed these quiet drives, just me and the open road, away from the noise of the city. I'd taken this route countless times before, but tonight felt different. The air was thicker, almost oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone out here. The road wound through rolling hills, with fields stretching far beyond the horizon. I passed a few dilapidated barns, their broken windows reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. It was the kind of place where time seemed to have stopped, silent, isolated, and forgotten. As I drove, the familiar sound of my tires crunching over the gravel faded, replaced by a strange, distant echo, almost like footsteps following behind me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone. But there was no one, just empty road stretching out behind me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Maybe it was just my imagination. But as I drove further, the feeling only grew stronger. It was as if someone was watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. Eventually, I reached an old, overgrown trail leading into the woods. I couldn't help but take a detour, curious about the trees that loomed ahead. The leaves crunched beneath my tires as I ventured deeper into the forest. The air became cooler and the sounds of nature seemed to fade, leaving only silence. The trees stretched high above, their branches forming a dense canopy, blocking out the last rays of sunlight. It felt as if I had stepped into a different world, one untouched by time. I stopped the car and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the crisp, cool air. The forest felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The wind whispered through the trees, but there were no birdsong, no rustling of animals, just the stillness of the woods. I wandered off the trail, following a narrow footpath that seemed to beckon me deeper into the forest. Every step felt heavier, as if the trees themselves were watching, their twisted limbs casting dark shapes on the ground. Then I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps. This time, they weren't distant or echoing. They were close, too close. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The woods seemed to hold their breath, waiting. I slowly turned around, expecting to see something, or someone, standing behind me. But there was nothing. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought the panic rising in my throat. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own shaky breathing. I clutched my phone tightly, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. I must have been imagining things. It had to be the isolation, the eerie quiet of the woods. I told myself that over and over, but deep down, I knew better. I retraced my steps, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the path harder to see in the dim light. My flashlight flickered, then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with my phone, trying to turn the flashlight back on, but it was dead. My signal had vanished, and I realized just how far I'd strayed from the main road. Panic set in. The feeling of being lost was overwhelming. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. Closer this time. I could feel them behind me, just beyond the edge of my vision. I spun around, my breath hitching in my throat. Still, no one. I forced myself to walk faster, the crunching of leaves beneath my feet now sounding like whispers, like the trees themselves were speaking. The woods felt endless, as if they had no intention of letting me go. After what felt like hours, I stumbled onto an old, faded trail marker. The letters were barely legible, but I could just make out the word path etched into the wood. I followed the marker, hoping it would lead me back to my car. The silence was deafening, but at least now I had a point of reference. I kept my head down, not wanting to look behind me, where I knew something, or someone, was watching. Finally, I broke through the tree line and saw my car waiting in the distance, bathed in the faint glow of the moon. I didn't stop running until I reached it, slamming the door shut behind me. As I drove away, the weight in my chest eased, but the feeling of being followed didn't. I knew I'd be looking over my shoulder for a long time. What had been out there in the woods with me? I still don't know, and I don't think I ever want to find out. I still remember that trip to the old library. It wasn't like the modern ones with glass walls and computer stations. This library had a heavy, musty smell, old wooden shelves creaking beneath countless books, the kind of place that felt like it hadn't been touched in decades. My friends and I had stumbled upon it while wandering through a quiet, forgotten town. The library sat at the edge of a narrow, winding street. We were drawn to it, not by any plan, but by sheer curiosity. It looked abandoned, its windows cracked, paint peeling from the facade. The sign above the entrance swayed gently in the wind, its faded letters barely readable. Inside, it was eerily quiet. The air felt heavy, as though the space itself had been sealed off from the world. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light. I remember feeling a strange stillness, as if the room itself was holding its breath. There was no one there, just the four of us. We wandered through the aisles, running our fingers along the spines of the old books, their titles long forgotten. The atmosphere was strange, almost oppressive. The silence seemed to throb, each creak of the wooden floorboards louder than it should have been. It wasn't until I stumbled across an old journal resting on one of the shelves that things started to feel off. The journal was thick, its cover worn with age. I opened it, curious, and began flipping through the pages. The handwriting was shaky, filled with strange symbols and passages that made no sense. Some entries were incomprehensible. Others spoke of things that shouldn't be known. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the scribbles, my hands trembling as I flipped further. But what truly unsettled me was a single line written on the very last page. It was as if someone had scrawled it in a panic, hurried and jagged. They are watching. They have always been watching. I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something. Anything. But the library remained empty. The others were still exploring, oblivious to the unease that had taken hold of me. I hurried to put the journal back, but when I turned around, the air grew colder. A shadow shifted in the corner of my vision. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the same old shelves and the thick silence. My friends returned, laughing about some old book they'd found. I couldn't tell them about what I had seen. What if they thought I was imagining things? Or worse, what if they laughed it off like it was nothing? We stayed for a while longer, trying to enjoy the quiet atmosphere. But every so often, I felt those eyes again. Watching, always watching. The feeling stayed with me long after we left the library, and to this day, I wonder who or what was there, waiting for us. It started with the sound of knocking. A rhythmic, insistent knocking that echoed through the otherwise silent apartment building. It was late, way past midnight, and everyone else had long since gone to bed. I was on the second floor, alone in my small one-bedroom apartment, the kind of place where the walls are thin and every sound feels amplified. I had just finished reading when I first heard it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 soft taps. I assumed it was my imagination at first, some sound from outside or in the building. But then, after a moment of silence, it came again. Louder this time, as if whoever was knocking had grown impatient. I set the book down and walked to the front door, listening closely. The knocking wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the wall behind the couch. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. The wall was solid, and there was nothing on the other side. No neighbors, no rooms, just the faint echoes of an empty hallway. The knocking continued, relentless, as though something was trying to get my attention. I backed away from the door, heart pounding. The sound wasn't going away. It wasn't random either. There was a pattern, like someone had a method. It wasn't someone outside. It felt deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was doing this knew I was here. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or a pipe, but the knocking was far too deliberate. Too precise. I sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the wall, waiting for it to stop. But it didn't. Hours passed, and the knocking never wavered. By now, I was too scared to go near the wall. Sleep felt impossible. I was paralyzed by the thought that someone, was on the other side trying to reach me. When morning finally arrived, the knocking had stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. I checked the wall, tapped it, but there was no indication of anything unusual. No hidden door, no cracks, just a regular wall, flat and smooth. I told myself it was over, that my imagination had gotten the better of me. But when I opened the front door to check the hallway, I froze. There, scrawled across the wall in what looked like smeared dirt, were 3 words. Let me out. I slammed the door shut and didn't sleep again for days. I never believed in curses. At least, not until that day at the old vineyard. It was a hot summer afternoon, the kind where the sun feels too close and everything feels quiet. My friends and I decided to visit the vineyard just outside town, a place that had always been talked about in hushed whispers. The old stories said the vineyard was abandoned after a family tragedy, that something had happened there long ago, a fire, a disappearance, or something worse. We drove up the cracked gravel road, surrounded by nothing but vines stretching endlessly into the horizon. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, but we ignored it, eager for the adventure. We parked and wandered through the rows of withered grapevines, their leaves brittle and brown, like they hadn't seen care in decades. As we made our way deeper into the vineyard, a strange sense of unease began to creep in. The silence was absolute. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the heavy, oppressive quiet of the vines pressing in around us. We eventually stumbled upon an old barn, its roof partially caved in, vines crawling up the weathered walls. We ventured inside, careful not to disturb the cobwebs hanging from the rafters. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the old wood beneath our feet. It was there, in that musty barn, that we found the old trunk. It was rusted shut, sitting in the corner like it had been forgotten for decades. My friend, Mark, pushed at the lid, but it wouldn't budge. "Let's leave it," I said, but something about the trunk drew us in, like a magnet. Mark grabbed a crowbar from the corner and pried open the lid. Inside, we found faded photographs, yellowed letters, and an old diary. The diary had a name written in faded ink. Elena. We flipped through the pages, reading about her life on the vineyard, her family, her dreams, and the slow, tragic unraveling of their once thriving land. Elena had written about losing everything, of strange occurrences in the vineyard, and of a curse that had followed her family for generations. "I thought this was just a legend," Mark muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The more we read, the heavier the air seemed to become. It was like the barn itself was pushing down on us. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine as I read something that stopped me cold. They say the vineyard takes what it wants, and what it wants is you. Before I could even process what I'd read, a sudden, sharp sound echoed through the barn, like something had snapped. We all turned, eyes wide, hearts pounding. The trunk slammed shut on its own, with a resounding crash that reverberated through the silence. Something was wrong. Something had changed. As we stepped outside, the vineyard felt different. The sun seemed to dim, and the once quiet air buzzed with a low, unnatural hum. I glanced back at the barn, but it was gone, replaced by a thick wall of vines that hadn't been there before. We ran. The vineyard stretched endlessly, but we didn't stop, feet pounding the dry dirt, hearts hammering in our chests. Every step felt like we were running through a dream. Everything around us twisted and distorted. That's when we heard it. Whispers. Voices on the wind, calling to us. Soft at first, then louder and more insistent. They weren't human voices. They were cold, hollow, and filled with a dark hunger. We didn't stop, even when the vines began to close in around us. We could feel something, watching, waiting, as if the land itself was alive, breathing and yearning. When we finally broke free from the vineyard, the town was nowhere to be seen. The road that had brought us there had vanished. We wandered aimlessly, lost and terrified, the echoes of those whispers still lingering in our ears. To this day, we've never spoken of what happened that afternoon. The vineyard isn't talked about anymore, and the old town avoids it entirely. But I know one thing. There's something out there, something waiting, buried deep in the vines, and I'm not sure it's ever truly gone. I've always loved hiking, the kind of adventure that gets you far away from the noise of the city. So one weekend, I decided to explore a trail that few people talked about. It was located deep in the mountains, surrounded by dense forests and valleys so remote, the maps barely showed any signs of civilization. My plan was simple. Hike all day, set up camp, and enjoy the peace and quiet. The trailhead was nothing more than a narrow dirt path hidden behind a row of thick trees. The first few hours were perfect. Sunlight filtered through the towering pines, birds chirped, and the air was crisp and fresh. The trail became steeper as I ascended, but I didn't mind. I relished the solitude, letting the quiet envelop me. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to find a spot to set up my tent. I chose a small clearing near a stream, tucked away from the trail. It was picturesque, surrounded by towering evergreens and the soft trickling of water. I pitched my tent, unpacked some snacks, and settled down with a book, taking a deep breath of fresh mountain air. The silence was soothing at first, but as the day wore on, it started to feel oppressive. There was no wildlife, no rustling in the trees, no distant sounds of animals. It was as if the forest itself had gone completely still. I tried to push it aside, convinced I was imagining things. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows, I decided to take a short walk by the stream. The water was clear and cold, the perfect spot to reflect. I stood there, mesmerized by the way the light danced on the surface until I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. It wasn't the cool mountain air, it was something else entirely. I looked around, and the forest had become unnervingly silent. Even the breeze had stopped. The only sound now was the rushing water of the stream. I shook off the uneasy feeling and turned back toward my tent. That's when I saw it. Just at the edge of the clearing, a figure stood there, perfectly still, staring at me. It wasn't human. Its shape was wrong. Too tall, too thin. The head was tilted at an odd angle as if it couldn't quite move properly. Its eyes glowed faintly, hollow and unnatural. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were frozen to the ground. I blinked, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. I stood there, heart hammering, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, the stillness pressing in on me. I grabbed my pack and rushed back to the tent, every sound echoing too loudly in my ears. I didn't sleep that night. The wind returned, but it howled now, as if the forest itself was alive. Shadows danced around my tent, flickering in and out of view. Every creak of the tent fabric made me jump, my breath quickening with every passing second. At dawn, I packed up as fast as I could, leaving my campsite behind. I didn't care about the trail, about taking in the sights. All I wanted was to get back to the safety of the familiar world. As I stumbled down the trail, my heart still racing, I looked back one last time. The forest was still as quiet and empty as before. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. Whatever had been there, watching me, was still out there, waiting. It was supposed to be a quiet trip to the lake. Just a few friends and I, escaping the city for the weekend. The plan was simple. Set up camp by the water, fish, and relax under the stars. No cell service, no distractions, just nature. I had been looking forward to it, needing the break from the noise of everyday life. We drove deep into the forest, following the narrow, winding path that led to our campsite. The trees stretched endlessly on either side of us, their thick canopies blocking out the sun. It was peaceful, serene. We found a spot right by the edge of the lake, unpacked and set up our tents. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, we built a fire, roasting marshmallows and enjoying the quiet. Night fell quickly, the lake reflecting the faint glow of the crescent moon. We sat around the fire, telling stories and laughing. It was as perfect as I had imagined. But then the noises started. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable, a soft, echoing hum, as if the forest itself was breathing. I mentioned it to my friends, but they waved it off, saying it was probably just the wind through the trees. I wasn't so sure. The sound didn't seem natural, and the longer we listened, the more it felt like it was growing closer. Eventually, we all fell silent. The hum had turned into something more distinct, a series of low, guttural whispers. I strained to hear what they were saying, but they were too faint, too distorted. It felt as though they were coming from the trees, surrounding us, but there was no one there. One of my friends, Mark, stood up abruptly and walked toward the edge of the campsite. "It's nothing," he muttered, his voice shaky. "Just the forest playing tricks." But I could see the tension in his shoulders. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they were louder now, more distinct. And then there was a sound that made my blood run cold, a faint scratching, not from the trees or the ground, but from inside the forest itself. It was like something was clawing its way closer, scraping against the bark. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He was frozen, staring at the trees like he'd seen a ghost. And then it happened. A figure stepped out from the shadows. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its form was thin and gaunt, almost skeletal, but its face was obscured by darkness. No features, no eyes, just emptiness. It moved toward us, its steps slow and deliberate, as if it didn't belong in this world. The whispers had become screams now, piercing and agonized. I could feel my heart racing, my body frozen in place. My friends were shouting, but the sound of their voices barely registered. The figure was getting closer, the scratching louder, almost as if it were dragging itself through the trees. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure stopped. It stood there, maybe a few feet away, completely still. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The whispers had stopped too, replaced by an unbearable silence that felt like it was suffocating us. The air grew colder, heavy, almost suffocating. I could see my breath in the night. Then, from behind us, another sound. The faintest rustle of footsteps. Not from the figure, but from the trees. Something was circling us, moving through the shadows. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I grabbed Mark's arm and pulled him toward the fire. My friends followed, and we stumbled over each other, rushing back to our tents. The whispers were now screams, the rustling footsteps growing louder, echoing through the trees. We didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the trees, every whisper in the dark sent shivers down our spines. Whatever had come for us wasn't leaving. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. It was alive. In the morning, we packed up and left as quickly as we could. The whispers, the figure, the scratching, all of it had vanished by sunrise. But the fear hadn't. To this day, I wonder what we encountered that night. Some part of me still expects to hear those whispers, see that figure wherever I go. And deep down, I know we weren't alone out there. It started as an ordinary day at home. I lived alone in a small apartment in the city. Nothing special ever happened, and I liked it that way. But one evening, everything changed. The air was crisp, and I decided to open my window to let in some fresh air. The sounds of the city drifted up, cars honking, distant voices, the hum of traffic. But that evening, it felt different. The usual background noise was quieter, as if the city had fallen into some strange kind of hush. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe everyone else was just quieter tonight. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the couch, flipping through a book. But my focus was slipping. I felt like something was watching me. I couldn't shake the sensation, so I glanced toward the window. The street below was eerily quiet. No cars passed, no people walked by. It was like the world had suddenly gone still. I decided to step onto my balcony, which overlooked the narrow alley between my building and the next. The air felt colder, more oppressive. I leaned against the railing, trying to shake off the feeling of unease, but it only grew stronger. I swear, the alley had never looked this dark before. The street lamps that usually lit the way barely cast any glow tonight. Everything was in shadows. That's when I noticed it. Movement. At first, I thought it was a stray cat, but the figure that emerged from the darkness didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally in ways that defied logic. It glided more than walked, its movements fluid but disjointed. I couldn't see its face, but there was something about the way it moved. So wrong, so unnatural, that sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The figure seemed to float closer to my building, heading toward the alley where I stood. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I was too scared to look back outside. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting by the door, afraid to even breathe too loudly. The next day, I didn't see anything unusual, but the fear lingered. I went about my routine, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. That night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept the lights on in every room, my eyes darting between the windows and the dark spaces beyond. Around midnight, I heard a soft knocking at the door. My heart stopped. I froze, my breath hitching. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was on the other side was counting each tap. I grabbed my phone and backed away, heart racing. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaking. There was no response, just that relentless knocking. I stood there, unable to move, listening to the sound echo through my apartment. Then came a louder knock, followed by the faintest whisper, barely audible, "Let me in." I bolted the door and hid under my bed. I didn't come out until morning, my mind in a fog of fear and disbelief. To this day, I never found an explanation for what I saw or heard. But I know one thing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something human. I never thought a simple evening trip to the beach could turn into something so terrifying. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quick getaway with a few friends. Just a drive down to the coast, a few hours of quiet by the water, and the calm of the waves lapping against the shore. We arrived around sunset, the sky a canvas of deep oranges and purples. The beach was nearly empty, save for a few other couples and a group of friends setting up a fire further down. The air was crisp but not cold, the sound of the waves a soothing backdrop. My friends and I found a spot near the water, spread out our blanket, and cracked open a few beers. It was perfect, peaceful, relaxing. We talked about nothing important, watching the horizon as the sun dipped lower into the sea. It was when the sky went dark that things started to feel off. The first clue came when I noticed the distant glow of a single flashlight, bobbing up and down as if someone were walking toward us along the shore. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe someone out for a late-night stroll. But then I noticed the way the light kept moving erratically, as if they couldn't decide where they were going. "Hey, does anyone else see that?" I asked, pointing toward the light. My friends followed my gaze, squinting into the darkness. "Probably just someone lost," one of them shrugged, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The closer the light got, the more it seemed to flicker, as though whoever was carrying it couldn't see what they were doing. It bobbed and darted erratically, weaving along the water's edge like something lost at sea. Then, suddenly, the light disappeared. I was about to dismiss it when a low, guttural moan carried over the sound of the waves. My friends froze, glancing around. "What was that?" someone whispered. We all strained our ears, searching the darkness. The moan came again, this time louder, more distinct. It didn't sound human, more like a creature, something primal and unsettling. The moans echoed between the cliffs, bouncing across the empty beach. "Let's get out of here," someone said, their voice trembling. We grabbed our stuff and started walking back toward the car, the unease growing with every step. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of black beach stretching before us. It wasn't until we reached the car that the second clue hit me. My phone buzzed. No service. Not a single bar. The town was only about 20 minutes away, and usually we'd have signal. But now, nothing. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances as we climbed into the car. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As I drove, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror. The beach was behind us, just darkness now, but I still felt like something was there, something following us. That's when I saw it, barely visible in the dim glow of the headlights. A figure, tall, thin, and hunched over, walking in the opposite direction from us, toward the shore. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who the hell is that?" one of my friends whispered, staring in shock at the figure. I couldn't answer. The figure didn't look human. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it were studying us from afar. And that flashlight, it wasn't being held properly. It bobbed erratically as if whoever was holding it couldn't see straight. The figure moved closer to the water's edge, fading in and out of the darkness, then stopped. It stood there, motionless, staring in our direction. My friends and I didn't wait to find out what it was. I hit the gas, tires squealing as we raced back toward town. The whole way, I kept glancing back, expecting to see the figure chasing us. But it was gone. When we got to the edge of town, I pulled over, gasping for air. The tension was still there, but nothing followed us. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us, waited, and we had been too blind to notice. We've never spoken of that night again. My friends and I had been planning a hiking trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the quiet, untouched beauty of the mountains. We were tired of screens and the constant noise of everyday life. This would be our chance to disconnect and recharge. The trailhead was only about an hour's drive from town, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, and the towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The trail was well worn, though not overly crowded. It was perfect. As we started the hike, the conversations flowed, and we basked in the sounds of nature, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. We decided to set up camp a few miles in, beside a stream that meandered through the forest. The spot felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. As we set up our tents and built a fire, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just some wildlife, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But as the evening deepened, the sounds grew more distinct. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There were footsteps, quiet at first, but steady, following us. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. The woods were still except for the distant hum of insects. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to worry them, but my nerves were already fraying. Every step we took, I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. It wasn't just wildlife out there anymore. By the time we made it to camp, the shadows had grown long and deep. The fire we built crackled loudly, and we huddled close, trying to keep warm. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see someone emerge, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until later, after we had settled in, that I noticed something strange. The footsteps, whatever was following us, they had stopped. The forest was silent once again. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, hollow, as though something had vanished. I woke up a few hours later, shivering. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, but the night was still warm. I stepped out of my tent, hoping some fresh air would calm me. As I stood there, looking at the quiet trees, I noticed something bizarre. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. The forest was completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven breathing. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was shallow, labored, almost as if whatever was out there was struggling to draw air. The sound wasn't far from where we had camped, but the direction was unclear. I felt like whatever was out there was looking for us, and now that it had found us, it was circling closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. Those footsteps earlier, they weren't just following us. They were guiding something toward us, toward the camp. I could feel the presence growing closer. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I wake my friends? But what could I tell them? I didn't want to put them in more danger than they already were. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. And then I saw it. A figure, tall, obscured by darkness but unmistakable. Its form wasn't human. It seemed wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. It stared at me from the edge of the trees, unmoving, its hollow eyes glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared back, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could see now, the uneven, staggering gait as if it wasn't fully human. The outline of its face was blurred, almost as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My friends never woke up. By dawn, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I woke them and told them we needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. None of them questioned it. We hiked out of the forest, and I've never gone back. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But even now, I can't forget those hollow eyes, staring from the darkness. Whatever it was, I don't believe we were alone that night. I had always enjoyed hiking alone. The quiet solitude of nature was something I craved, especially after long, stressful weeks. One summer afternoon, I decided to head to a remote trail I'd been eyeing for months. It wasn't marked on most maps, secluded deep in the forest. The trailhead was a dirt path hidden off a narrow road, barely visible to anyone passing by. The hike started as usual. The air was cool, filled with the scent of pine, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I reveled in the stillness, lost in the rhythm of my footsteps and the sound of birds overhead. For hours, I trekked through the dense woods, following the winding trail deeper into the forest. The trail eventually began to narrow, the trees pressing in around me. It wasn't long before I realized I'd lost my bearings. I pulled out my map and compass, but neither gave me any clue as to which direction I should go. I sat down on a large rock, trying to collect my thoughts, but the sense of isolation began to creep in. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that I wasn't truly lost, just turned around. But as the hours passed and the sunlight dimmed, I started feeling something was wrong. The forest felt heavier. The usual sounds of birds had fallen silent, replaced by an eerie quiet. It was as though the woods themselves had become aware of my presence. I pressed on, my pace quickening, though fear began to seep into my bones. I needed to get out of there. The trail eventually split into two. I didn't know which way to go, so I flipped a coin. Heads. I took the right path. The further I went, the more the trees seemed to loom, their branches stretching out like twisted fingers. The sun had set, leaving the forest in near total darkness. I pulled out my flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the thick canopy above. Shadows danced in the light, appearing as figures just beyond my sight. Suddenly, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the sound of my own boots against the ground, but something lighter, quicker. I stopped and held my breath, listening. The footsteps continued, approaching rapidly, echoing unnaturally close. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. No response, just the sound of rustling leaves. I tightened my grip on my flashlight, shining it in every direction. The forest felt alive now, shifting in ways I couldn't comprehend. I took off running, but the footsteps followed, always just behind me. I could hear them breathing, ragged and shallow, as though the thing was right on my heels. I didn't dare look back, but I knew whatever it wasn't human. The woods seemed to close in tighter, the trees bending and creaking with every step I took. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran until my legs couldn't carry me anymore. Exhausted, I collapsed against a tree, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped. The forest fell deathly quiet again. I could feel something watching me, something I couldn't see, yet I knew it was there, standing just beyond my sight. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that danced along the trees. The world around me seemed to blur, and then, in the dim light, I saw it. A figure, standing in the distance, motionless. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it wasn't human. Its presence radiated something cold, something inhuman. Tears streamed down my face as I turned and ran. The woods stretched endlessly, the path disappearing beneath my feet. I could hear it again, the sound of footsteps, lighter now but unmistakably close. And then, through the haze, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of my flashlight's beam, I glimpsed something hanging from a tree, faint and twisted in the darkness. A figure, a face. It wasn't human, not anymore, just a hollow, warped shape that hung from the tree, swaying gently in the wind. I screamed and ran faster, but I knew it was always right behind me. I didn't stop, couldn't stop, until I burst out of the forest and stumbled into the light of day, gasping for air. I made it out, but even now, I can still feel it, watching, waiting, in the dark, just beyond the edge of sight. I still can't explain what happened that night, but I know it changed me. It started as an ordinary evening, one I'll never forget. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew each other but no one really talked. I lived in a small apartment building that sat on the edge of town. There was a small green space between my building and the one next door, a small, overgrown park that most people seem to forget about. That night, I decided to go for a walk. Nothing strange about that, just me, some headphones, and a desire to clear my head. The air was cool, the streets nearly deserted. As I wandered toward the park, something about the atmosphere felt off. It wasn't just the silence or the empty streets. It was a deeper, more unsettling feeling, like the world had shifted slightly off kilter. I arrived at the park and noticed how different it felt from the last time I'd been there. The grass was overgrown, weeds pushed through the cracks in the pavement. The air smelled strange, almost metallic like blood. I ignored it, telling myself it was just the city noise creeping into my thoughts. I took a few steps into the park, the faint glow of the streetlights flickering. Suddenly, I heard something, the sound of footsteps. My heart jumped as I turned around, expecting to see someone behind me. But there was no one, just the empty path, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I shook my head, assuming it was my imagination, and started walking again. The crunch of gravel under my shoes felt too loud. That's when I noticed something strange. A figure standing at the far end of the park beneath one of the dim streetlights. It wasn't moving, just standing there, head tilted, staring at me. I froze. There was something off about the figure. It wasn't human, at least not in any way I could comprehend. The shape was distorted, elongated, like a tall black silhouette but with no discernible features. No eyes, no mouth, just pure darkness. The way it stood felt unnatural, as if it didn't belong to this world. I couldn't look away. My legs felt like stone, frozen in place as I watched this thing. It didn't seem to move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive. Then, as if sensing my fear, the figure shifted, just slightly. Its body contorted in a way that seemed impossible, unnatural. It leaned toward me, and I swear I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I didn't want to wait around to find out what would happen next. I turned and bolted, my breath ragged as I sprinted back toward the street. My mind raced, trying to convince me that I had imagined the figure. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was back inside my apartment, locked safely behind the door. I sat there, the lights off, waiting for morning. My hands trembled as I replayed the figure in my mind. I don't know what I saw that night, but it wasn't human, and whatever it was, I can feel it still watching, waiting. I've always loved spending my weekends exploring nature, far from the city lights and noise. A few friends and I decided to go on a hiking trip into the mountains, remote trails, hidden caves, and the promise of peace. We left early on a Saturday, driving for hours into the wilderness, leaving behind cell service and any form of modern convenience. The trailhead was a quiet spot, surrounded by towering pines and the hum of insects buzzing in the heat. We set off, excited to lose ourselves in the trees and rocks. The trail was rough but rewarding, winding deeper into the forest as the day wore on. We didn't see a single person the entire time, just the distant sounds of birds and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. We stopped to rest after a few hours, finding a small clearing by a bubbling stream. It was serene, perfect for a break. We filled our bottles with cold water and spread out our packs, eating snacks and laughing. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. After eating, we decided to explore further. The trail continued on, snaking around the mountain, but something felt off. The quiet was louder than before, almost oppressive. My friends joked about how strange the silence was, but I wasn't laughing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't until we were deep in the woods that we noticed the marks on the trees. Long, claw-like scratches gouged into the bark, running high and low as if something large had passed through. I stopped, staring at them. My stomach churned. "Do you think a bear did this?" I asked, pointing. "No way," one of my friends replied, laughing. "Bears don't make marks like that. Look, these are way too high." I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The idea of a bear, or anything large, hadn't crossed my mind, but these marks were unnatural. We looked around, but the trees seemed lifeless, their silence stretching into an eerie stillness. We pressed on, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. By the time we reached the base of the mountain, the sun was low on the horizon. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. We decided it was time to head back, but something wasn't right. It felt like we were walking in circles, the trail no longer familiar. When we stopped to check our maps, we realized it wasn't the trail that had shifted. It was us. We weren't lost exactly, but we were disoriented, unable to find the landmarks we remembered. The air felt thicker, as though the forest had swallowed everything familiar. We retraced our steps, but nothing looked the same. Every tree felt like a stranger. We finally decided to make camp. It wasn't ideal, but we needed to rest. As night fell, the forest became even more silent. It was a different kind of quiet, one that felt heavy, almost oppressive. The usual sounds of insects and wildlife had vanished, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't sleep. Something felt off. My friends drifted into restless slumber, but I stayed awake, watching the shadows shift around the fire. Every little noise made me jump. The snap of a twig, the whisper of wind through the trees. I knew something was watching us. I just couldn't explain how I knew. At some point, I heard it. A low, distorted whisper. Faint at first, but growing louder. It came from the trees, as if something was calling to us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper became clearer, more insistent. "Come. Closer." The voice was not human. It was hollow, distant, like it came from the shadows themselves. My pulse quickened as I stared into the darkness, heart pounding. I woke my friends, but the whispering stopped as soon as they opened their eyes. The forest returned to silence. They didn't hear it. They didn't see anything. And as much as I wanted to dismiss it, I knew what I'd heard. The thing, whatever it was, hadn't left us. It was still there, waiting. In the morning, we packed up and made our way back down the mountain, moving as quickly as we could. The woods were still quiet, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, I looked behind us one last time. The trees loomed taller, darker, and deep within them, I knew we weren't alone. It was late summer, and I decided to take a day off to explore the old abandoned amusement park. No one had been there in years, and the place had become a local legend. I remember hearing whispers about it being haunted, but I always dismissed those tales as just folklore. The park sat just a few miles from town, hidden between the trees, its entrance overgrown with weeds and ivy. When I arrived, the sight of rusting roller coasters and decayed ticket booths sent a chill through me. The once vibrant colors of the rides had faded to dull grays and greens. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making your own breathing feel too loud. I stood at the entrance for a long moment, feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. I began exploring, walking through the empty park, my footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. There was a sense of emptiness so profound, it felt as if the park itself was holding its breath. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if the park had been waiting for someone like me to come back. The longer I wandered, the more unsettling it became. The rides loomed above, their rusted tracks creaking softly in the wind. I passed the old Ferris wheel, its once bright lights now dull and flickering weakly. The carousel had lost its once lively tunes, now reduced to the faintest of echoes. I decided to check out the haunted house ride. the most infamous attraction. The faded sign above the entrance read, "Dark Carnival." I hesitated, standing at the entrance, my heart thudding in my chest. The thought of venturing inside made my stomach churn, but curiosity won out. I stepped inside. The first few steps felt normal enough, but as I moved deeper, I noticed something strange. The air grew colder, and the silence became more oppressive. Shadows seemed to dance along the walls, shifting in ways they shouldn't. I could hear distant whispers, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. At one point, I came to a part of the ride where mirrors used to reflect the illusion of endless hallways. But, instead of reflections, I saw something far more disturbing. Shadows that stretched and writhed as if they were alive. My breath hitched, and I quickly turned away, my pulse racing. The further I explored, the more the whispers became distinct. They weren't voices, but something far more sinister. Low, echoing murmurs that seemed to come from inside my own head. I kept walking, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The walls around me seemed to pulse faintly, as if the place itself was alive. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted. I stumbled forward and fell, landing hard. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw something on the floor. A black handprint, impossibly large, as if made by something inhuman. My stomach twisted as I realized the prints led deeper into the maze of the haunted house. Terror gripped me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. The shadows felt closer now, watching, waiting. I pressed on, hearing the whispers growing louder, more insistent. It was as if whatever was there was feeding off my fear. Finally, I emerged from the dark maze and found myself back in the open air, beneath the pale light of the moon. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the feeling of being followed didn't fade. I glanced back toward the entrance of the haunted house. The whispers were now louder, as if they were surrounding me. Then I saw it, a figure standing motionless by the entrance, its face obscured by shadows. It wasn't human. Its eyes glowed faintly, a faint, otherworldly light that seemed to pierce through the darkness. I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the exit, every step feeling like it might be my last. The figure didn't follow, but I could still hear the whispers in my ears, clearer than ever. The next morning, I drove past the park on my way home. The place seemed just as desolate as before, but something felt different. The whispers still echoed in my head, and I swear I could hear them even now, as if whatever I encountered had found a way into my mind, and I could never escape it. It was a hot, quiet summer day when we decided to take the old boat out. My friends and I had grown up near the lake, and on weekends we'd usually head out to fish or just escape the dull routine of life. That day was supposed to be no different. We packed the boat with supplies, beer, snacks, and fishing gear, and set off. The lake stretched out before us, endless and still. The surface shimmered under the sun, and apart from the occasional call of a bird, there was nothing but silence. We didn't talk much, the kind of peace that comes from knowing each other so well. You don't always need to fill the quiet. We anchored the boat in the middle of the lake, far from the shore, where the water was deepest. We tossed our lines into the water and relaxed, letting the day stretch out before us. The surface of the water rippled gently, and I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, letting my thoughts drift. It was one of those perfect summer afternoons. Hours passed. I'd started to doze off when something woke me, a faint, distant thud. I sat up, blinking into the sun. The others didn't seem to notice. The thud came again, faint but persistent, like something heavy being dragged across the water. I frowned and looked around, but the lake remained eerily still. I shook off my unease, convinced it was nothing more than my imagination. The water was calm, no signs of boats or other people in sight. I was about to lie back down when I noticed something. Just a ripple in the water. Something moving just beneath the surface. At first, I figured it was a fish or maybe even a log, but the more I watched, the more it seemed unnatural. It wasn't just a ripple, it was deliberate, as if something was swimming just beneath us, circling the boat. "Guys," I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended. They didn't respond, lost in their own world, fishing lines slack in the water. The thudding continued, now much louder, vibrating through the hull of the boat. I glanced down into the water again, heart pounding. The ripple grew closer. I saw something, just for a split second. 2 dark shapes moving beneath the surface. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The boat was silent except for the relentless thudding and the faint dragging sounds beneath us. The water seemed to grow darker, almost as if it were being pulled down into some unseen void. I had to wake my friends. "Guys, get up, something's wrong," I shouted, my voice trembling. They stirred, groggy but alert. I pointed toward the water, struggling to find words. My throat felt dry. "There's something down there. I don't know what it is, but it's not natural." They peered over the edge, eyes widening as they saw the dark shapes in the water. "What the hell is that?" one of them whispered. The thudding grew louder, and we could feel the vibrations in the floor of the boat. Something was approaching from beneath, something large. A chilling realization settled in my gut. Whatever it wasn't just a fish or a log. Panic swept through us. We didn't even bother pulling in our fishing lines. I grabbed the oars, and we frantically rowed toward the shore, the thudding and dragging noise growing louder, echoing beneath the surface. When we reached the shallower waters near the shore, the sounds stopped. The water became still again, unnaturally calm. We didn't look back, didn't dare. We made it home that day, shaken and silent. I've never been back to that lake. Whatever it was down there, whatever was dragging itself beneath the surface, I hope I never find out. It was a quiet evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old cemetery. The thought of it used to make me uneasy, but over the years, I'd grown used to its stillness. It was nestled at the edge of town, surrounded by trees that loomed over the grave markers like silent sentinels. I used to come here whenever I wanted solitude, away from the noise of daily life. That night, something felt off. Even though I'd walked these grounds countless times, the air felt heavier, thicker. The sky was overcast, casting everything in a dim gray light. I didn't see another soul around, which wasn't unusual. The place had long since fallen into disuse. The graves seemed older than I remembered, some barely legible, the inscriptions worn away by time. As I wandered through the rows, something caught my attention. Faint whispers, too quiet to make out but insistent. I strained my ears, expecting to hear nothing but silence, yet the whispers grew louder. Not words, just hushed murmurs as if someone was close, though I couldn't see anyone. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe the wind was playing tricks on me, but the hairs on my neck stood up. The cemetery had always been quiet, peaceful, but tonight it felt like I wasn't alone. Then I saw him, or rather, it. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, blending with the shadows. A man, or at least I thought it was a man. He stood at the edge of a broken gravestone, motionless, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but felt. My heart pounded. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, I could make out more of its features, or rather, the lack of them. There was no face, just a void where the eyes should have been, empty and black. It wasn't human, not anymore. My breath hitched, and I realized I couldn't look away. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, growing more insistent. The figure raised its hand, reaching toward me, and I felt something inside me snap. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. The graves blurred past me, the whispering growing louder, more urgent. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence closing in. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods, my legs giving out beneath me. I collapsed against a tree, trembling, waiting for something to happen. but the figure never followed. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to speak. The whispers faded, leaving only the silence. When I finally got to my feet and looked back, the cemetery was empty. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to know. I haven't returned to the cemetery since. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon at home, the kind of day when the world slows down and you finally have a chance to relax, the kind of day you take for granted, never expecting anything unusual to happen. I live alone in a small apartment on the edge of town. It's nothing fancy, just a cramped place with thin walls and old wooden floors that creak underfoot. Most of my neighbors are long gone, or at least that's what it felt like. The quiet was almost deafening, only broken by the occasional car passing by on the distant road. That day, I decided to stay in and watch some old movies, something to distract me from the creeping sense of boredom. Around 3 p.m., I popped a DVD into the player and sank into the worn-out couch. The room was dim, the sunlight filtering through dusty blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. For a while, it was peaceful. I was lost in the flickering images on the screen when something made me glance toward the window. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. The street outside was still. No cars, no pedestrians. Just that unrelenting silence. But then, a faint movement caught my eye. It was barely noticeable, just a flicker at the edge of the glass. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. A figure. It wasn't standing still. No, it was shifting, pacing. Something tall and thin, too thin. Its form seemed distorted, almost like it wasn't fully there. The more I stared, the more I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't human. I wasn't even sure it was real. My gut told me to look away, but I couldn't. I was locked in place, unable to move, the figure growing clearer with each passing second. Its face, if it had one, was blank. Just an empty expanse where eyes should have been. It didn't blink, it didn't breathe. Then it tilted its head toward me, as if it could sense my gaze. My pulse quickened. I felt exposed, like it could see right through me. I wanted to look away, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I felt paralyzed by some invisible force. The figure raised one long, spindly arm, its fingers dragging against the glass. I could hear the faint scratch like nails on a chalkboard, but it wasn't loud. It was almost whispered. The sound reverberated in my head, filling the room with a sense of unbearable dread. Tears stung my eyes, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The figure moved closer to the window, its form bending, folding in strange, unnatural ways. Its steps were slow, deliberate, as if it were studying me. The closer it got, the less it resembled anything human. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. Its head tilted even farther, as if inspecting me from afar. I could feel its gaze burrowing into my soul. It didn't blink, didn't move. Time seemed to stretch. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling. The silence in the room had become oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. Then it spoke, or rather, it didn't. I heard no words, no sound at all, but somehow I understood what it was saying. The message was clear. You can't escape. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. The figure didn't need to speak. It wasn't just standing there. It had crossed over somehow, into my world. It knew I couldn't run. I could feel its presence in my very bones, a suffocating, malignant force that had no intention of leaving. I knew, without a doubt, that it was watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, maybe. Eventually, the figure retreated, vanishing into the shadows. The silence remained, but the sense of its presence lingered, like a breath on my neck. I never saw it again, but I know it's still there, waiting. I'll never forget that day. It started out ordinary enough. My friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the nearby lake. We weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a few hours of peace, some fishing, and maybe a swim if we felt like it. Nothing seemed unusual as we packed up and drove down the winding dirt road leading to the lake. We'd been going to this spot for years. It was remote, surrounded by trees and hills, with no cell service and few visitors, the kind of place where you could truly get away from everything. When we arrived, the sun was high in the sky, and the lake shimmered under its light. We set up a small camp by the shore, blankets, coolers filled with drinks, and a fishing line tossed into the water. It was the kind of day where you lose track of time, relaxing in the warm sun. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The first sign came when we noticed the birds went quiet. The chirping had gradually died down, but we didn't think much of it. It wasn't until we glanced up at the sky that something truly strange happened. The clouds seemed to darken, even though the sun was still shining brightly. It was as if the world had turned gray for a moment, without warning. I looked around, feeling a knot of discomfort form in my stomach. My friends were laughing, oblivious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wandered a bit away from the camp, standing at the edge of the water, staring out into the lake. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing at the far side of the lake. It wasn't moving, just standing there as though it were staring directly at me. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light or someone from a distant campsite, but no one ever came to this part of the lake. The figure was still too far away for me to make out any details, but the sensation of being watched deepened. I called out to my friends, trying to shake off the unease. They didn't hear me. Or if they did, they didn't seem concerned. I didn't want to ruin the day with my paranoia, so I pushed the feeling aside. It wasn't until later that evening, when we were sitting around the campfire, that things got worse. The air had grown colder, the sun long set, leaving us with only the dim glow of the fire. The quiet was now oppressive, a stillness that felt unnatural. It wasn't like the calm of nature, it was like something had swallowed the sounds of the night. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. We talked, but the conversation felt forced, the laughter awkward. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every time I looked around, I saw nothing but trees and darkness. Then, from out of nowhere, we heard it. Soft, distorted whispers. They weren't coming from any direction. It was as if they surrounded us, echoing in the stillness. I strained to make out the words, but whatever was being said was too faint, too unnatural. I couldn't bring myself to ignore it anymore. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. They shook their heads, looking at me like I was imagining things. But then I saw it again, the figure, much closer now. It was standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. It was too dark to make out any features, only the faint silhouette, almost human, but not quite. The whispering intensified, as if the figure was breathing the sound into the air. Panic set in. I felt the cold rush through my veins, and my body trembled uncontrollably. I tried to call out again, but no words would come. The figure moved a step closer. It wasn't walking. It glided, as if pulled by some unseen force. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I felt my friends tugging at my arm, pulling me toward the campfire, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It felt like whatever this thing was, it had me trapped. My friends didn't see it, didn't hear the whispers. They told me to snap out of it, convinced I was just spooked by the isolation. But then something happened that I'll never forget. The figure, which had been standing still for what felt like forever, suddenly turned and disappeared into the trees. One moment it was there, and the next, gone, like it had never existed. I tried to explain to my friends what I saw, what I felt, but they couldn't see it. The whispers returned for a brief moment, distant and faint. And then, just like before, silence. I've never been able to return to that lake. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what it wanted. All I know is that something was there, something that wasn't human, and no one else ever saw it. It was a quiet evening, and I had decided to go for a walk along the old, unused rail trail that ran near the edge of town. The trail had been out of service for decades, overgrown with thick underbrush and left to the elements. A relic from another time, it was now little more than a forgotten path through the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trail. I didn't expect to run into anyone. The town had grown quiet in recent years, and I figured it was the perfect time to clear my head. There wasn't much to hear other than the distant sound of the trees rustling in the wind and the occasional creak of an old sign swaying overhead. As I walked further along the trail, a chill started to settle in my bones. It wasn't just the cold air. There was something off about the silence, something unnatural. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. I shook it off, blaming my nerves, and pressed on. About halfway down the trail, I came across an old wooden bench. It was weathered and half-rotted, covered in moss and dirt. I decided to sit for a moment, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The woods around me seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, the wind sharper. I glanced up at the fading light of the horizon, the last hint of twilight vanishing into the thick trees. That's when I heard it, a faint, barely audible whisper carried on the wind. I strained to hear, but there was nothing, just the silence again. Maybe my imagination, I thought. But then, a second whisper, closer this time, like it was coming from the trees behind me. My breath hitched and I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. The woods were still. The trees loomed over the trail like silent sentinels, their branches creaking and swaying. I told myself to calm down, that it was probably just an animal. But deep down, I knew better. There was no animal making those whispers. It was like something, or someone, was trying to call out to me. I tried to walk away from the bench, but the whispers followed. They were louder now, as if they were closing in on me, their words indistinct but somehow menacing. I glanced behind, but there was nothing. Only the trees, silent and watchful. The trail curved ahead, disappearing into the shadows. I kept moving, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to come from all directions now, surrounding me like a dark fog. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was I losing my mind? Or was something out there? Something beyond explanation. Suddenly, I tripped over something in the grass, falling hard onto the dirt path. My hands scraped against the ground as I caught myself. Looking down, I saw it. A small, broken mirror lying face up, shards of glass reflecting nothing but my terrified expression. The whispers turned to a low, guttural whisper, almost like a chant. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but I could feel it resonating in my bones. I scrambled to my feet, my heart thudding wildly in my chest. That's when I saw them. Shadowy figures emerging from the trees. They weren't human, but they moved like people. Tall and hunched, their forms twisted and obscured by the dark. Their eyes glowed faintly, empty and hollow. They didn't speak, but their whispers continued, growing louder. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The shadows moved closer, closing in on me like a wave of darkness. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they stopped. The whispers faded, and the figures vanished into the trees once more. I stood there, breathless, staring into the darkness. When I dared to move again, there was nothing, only the echo of silence. The mirror lay shattered on the ground, its broken glass reflecting nothing but the void of the forest. I didn't stay long after that. I turned around and walked back, never looking over my shoulder again. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker. someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting, always watching.